In November of the year 2000, a user with the handle TimeTraveler0 appeared on a small online forum dedicated to time travel theory. The posts were technical, confident, and oddly specific. Within weeks, the user changed their name to John Titor and began making claims that would haunt researchers for decades. This is not a story about whether time travel is real. This is a story about information that appeared before it should have been possible to know it. About technical knowledge posted online that would not be publicly confirmed until years later. About a pattern of details so consistent that dismissing them requires almost as much effort as believing them. What follows is an investigation into one of the internet's most persistent mysteries. Not because the evidence is conclusive, but because it refuses to be easily explained away. The internet in the year 2000 was fundamentally different from what exists today. Broadband was rare. Most users connected through dial-up modems that screamed and hissed before establishing connection. Social media did not exist in any recognizable form. Forums were isolated communities, small islands of discussion where the same few dozen people might interact for years without ever knowing each other's real names. It was in this environment that something unusual happened, something that would generate more questions than answers for the next 2 decades. Chapter 1. The Man Who Appeared Online. The Time Travel Institute was one of several forums where enthusiasts discussed the theoretical physics of temporal displacement. Most participants were amateur theorists, science fiction fans, or curious individuals exploring ideas at the margins of accepted science. Discussions ranged from serious academic papers to wild speculation about grandfather paradoxes and bootstrap loops. On November 2nd, 2000, a new user appeared. The handle was TimeTravel0. The first post was simple, almost tentative. The user asked about the basics of time travel theory, seemingly gauging the community's level of sophistication. Within days, the tone shifted. TimeTraveler0 began answering questions rather than asking them. The posts were different from typical forum content. They lacked the breathless excitement of science fiction fans or the defensive posturing of people trying to prove fringe theories. The writing was calm, procedural, almost bureaucratic. The user wrote like someone filing a technical report. By November 21st, the user had changed their handle to John Titor. They explained that they were a soldier from the year 2038, sent back in time on a specific military assignment. The mission was not dramatic. It did not involve preventing wars or assassinating historical figures. It was a retrieval operation. Titor claimed he had been sent to the year 1975 to obtain an IBM 5100 computer. This machine, he explained, contained specific capabilities that were needed in his time. After collecting the computer, he had stopped in the year 2000 to visit family and to see the world before a series of catastrophic events that he claimed would reshape American society. The story was elaborate, but the internet had seen elaborate stories before. What made Titor unusual was his willingness to engage. He did not simply drop his claims and disappear, he stayed. He answered hundreds of questions over the course of 5 months. He provided technical diagrams. He discussed physics, sociology, and history. He described daily life in his time with mundane detail that seemed inconsistent with fiction. When users asked about future technology, he did not describe flying cars or utopian cities. He described a world that had regressed in some ways. Centralized infrastructure had failed. Communities were smaller, more localized. Technology existed but was simpler, more rugged, designed for reliability rather than advancement. He mentioned that music was still created, but distribution had changed. He said people grew their own food more often. He described a culture that had been through conflict and had emerged more cautious, more self-reliant, less trusting of large institutions. These details felt real in a way that science fiction often does not. They were boring. They were human scale. They suggested experience rather than imagination. Titor posted photographs. One showed the temporal displacement unit installed in the back of a vehicle. The image was grainy, taken with the low-resolution digital cameras available at the time. The device looked industrial, almost crude. Banks of equipment, cooling systems, control panels. It did not resemble Hollywood's sleek time machines. It looked like something built by engineers working under military constraints. He also posted hand-drawn diagrams explaining how the machine worked. The drawings were technical, but not polished. They looked like field notes, sketches made by someone who understood the mechanics, but was not a professional illustrator. The diagrams included labels, measurements and notations about gravitational fields and particle acceleration. Throughout his time on the forums, Titer maintained a consistent persona. He was polite but not warm. He answered questions directly but did not volunteer unnecessary information. He acknowledged skepticism without becoming defensive. When people called him a liar or a fraud, he responded that he understood their position and that he did not require belief. This restraint was unusual. Most hoaxes escalate. They become more dramatic, more desperate for validation. Titer did the opposite. He became more measured as time went on, as if the novelty of the conversation had worn off and he was simply fulfilling an obligation. On March 24, 2001, John Titor posted his final message. It was brief. He thanked the community for their questions and stated that he would be leaving. He did not specify where or when he was going. He did not promise to return. He simply stopped posting, and that was the end. No dramatic farewell, no final proof offered. Just silence. Chapter 2. The specifics that raised eyebrows. What separated John Titor from countless other internet mysteries was the depth and consistency of his technical knowledge. He did not just claim to have travelled through time, he explained in considerable detail how it was done. The device he described was called a C204 temporal displacement unit. It was manufactured, he said, by General Electric in the year 2034. The unit weighed approximately 500 pounds and required a vehicle for transport. Titor initially used a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette convertible, but later switched to a four-wheel drive truck, for practical reasons related to the gravitational effects of the device. The machine operated, according to Titor, by creating two microsingularities. These were not naturally occurring black holes but artificially generated ones, created through particle acceleration and magnetic containment. The singularities were held in a stable configuration by an electron injection manifold and a gravity sensor array. When activated, the singularities would generate an intense gravitational field around the vehicle. This field would warp spacetime in accordance with Einstein's theory of general relativity. By manipulating the rotation and position of the singularities, the operator could control the direction and magnitude of temporal displacement. Titor referenced Kerr black holes specifically. These are rotating black holes, first described mathematically by Roy Kerr in 1963 as a solution to Einstein's field equations. Unlike Schwarzschild black holes, which are non-rotating and have a single event horizon, Kerr black holes have two event horizons, and an ergosphere where space-time itself is dragged around the singularity. The ergosphere is critical. In theory, it is possible to extract energy from a Kerr black hole through a process called the Penrose process, proposed by Roger Penrose in 1969. Titor suggested that his machine exploited similar principles, using the frame-dragging effect of rotating singularities to achieve temporal displacement. This was not pseudoscience. Frame-dragging is a real phenomenon. It was predicted by Einstein and later confirmed by experiments such as Gravity Probe B, launched by NASA in 2004. The idea that rotating masses can drag space-time around them is accepted physics. Titor also discussed the concept of closed time-like curves, or CTCs. These are paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, theoretically allowing an object to return to an earlier point in time. CTCs are solutions to the equations of general relativity under specific conditions, such as near-rotating black holes, or in the presence of exotic matter with negative energy density. The mathematics Titor referenced were legitimate. The terminology was correct. The concepts were grounded in real theoretical physics, not invented jargon. This level of accuracy is difficult to achieve without a strong background in relativity and cosmology. But Titor went further. He He explained that time travel did not occur within a single timeline. Instead, each journey resulted in movement to a parallel world line. He described this using what he called the divergence percentage. Travel back 1 year, and you might diverge by 0.1%. Travel back 30 years, and the divergence could be 1 or 2%. This model aligned with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, first proposed by Hugh Everett III in his doctoral dissertation at Princeton in 1957. Everett suggested that every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each representing a different outcome. No wave function collapse occurs. All possibilities are realized in separate, non-communicating universes. Titer was applying this framework to time travel. In his model, travelling back in time was equivalent to moving from one branch of reality to another. You could not change your own past because you were never in your own past. You were in a nearly identical but separate world line. This solved the grandfather paradox elegantly. If you travelled back and prevented your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you would not cease to exist. You would simply be in a world line where you were never born. Your original world line would remain unchanged, still containing a version of you who travelled back. The implications were profound. It meant that time travellers could not prevent disasters in their own timeline. They could only create new timelines where those disasters did not occur. Every action in the past would create a branching point, a new universe diverging from the original. Titer claimed that his machine had a gravitational lock that prevented displacement of more than approximately 60 years. He said this was a safety feature, designed to avoid excessive divergence. The further you travelled, the more different the destination world line would be from your origin. He also explained that the process was not instantaneous. The journey involved what he called a gravity field that ramped up over time. The operator would experience a pulling sensation, followed by a brief period of disorientation as space-time reconfigured. Upon arrival, the field would dissipate, and the vehicle would be in the new time and place. The energy requirements, according to Titer, were substantial but manageable. The device drew power from a small but high-output source, possibly a compact fusion reactor or a contained antimatter reaction. He did not specify, suggesting that some details were classified even in his time. Throughout his explanations, Titer maintained a consistent voice. He was not evangelical. He did not insist that people believe him. He presented information as if filing a report for an audience of engineers. When asked questions beyond his expertise, he admitted he did not know. When challenged on physics, he engaged thoughtfully rather than deflecting. This consistency is difficult to maintain over hundreds of posts spanning 5 months. It requires either genuine knowledge or exceptional discipline. Chapter 3. Predictions made in advance. John Titor made numerous statements about the future. Some were vague, some were specific, and some aligned with events that occurred years after his posts, raising uncomfortable questions about how he could have known. He described a future marked by civil conflict in the United States. He said that by 2015, tensions between rural and urban populations would escalate into something resembling a civil war. He described it not as a traditional war with clear battle lines, but as a slow-burning conflict characterized by federal overreach, local resistance, and increasing breakdowns in trust. In the year 2000, this was not a mainstream narrative. The nation had just elected George W. Bush in a contested election, but the political climate was not yet defined by the extreme polarization that would characterize later years. Social media had not yet amplified divisions. The idea of civil conflict seemed remote to most people. Titer also mentioned that the conflict would be tied to issues of civil liberties and federal power. He suggested that a crisis, possibly related to terrorism or security concerns, would lead to increased government control. Citizens in rural areas, he claimed, would resist this control, leading to fractures that would deepen over time. By 2001, the September 11th attacks occurred. The Patriot Act was passed. Surveillance expanded. Debates about civil liberties intensified. Whether Titer predicted this or simply observed trends already in motion is unclear, but the alignment is notable. He predicted that CERN would discover miniature black holes around 2001. This did not happen exactly as stated. However, the Large Hadron Collider, which began operations in 2008, was designed in part to test theories related to micro-black holes and higher dimensional physics. Some theoretical models suggested that such black holes could be created, though none have been detected. Titer's claim about CERN is often cited as a failed prediction, but it is worth noting that his timeline divergence model allows for such failures. If his world line was 1 or 2% different from ours, events might occur at slightly different times, or not at all. He also mentioned mad cow disease. At the time, it was already a known issue, particularly in the United Kingdom, but Titer suggested it would become a more significant problem in the United States. By 2003, the first case of mad cow disease was confirmed in a cow in Washington state. The discovery led to widespread panic, beef recalls, and a temporary ban on American beef exports. Again, this was not a dramatic prediction. Mad cow disease was already in the news. But Titer's emphasis on it, in 2000, before it became a major American issue, shows a pattern of being slightly ahead of the curve. He described advances in computer technology that matched later developments. He mentioned multi-core processors, distributed computing, and the importance of legacy system compatibility. He said that in his time, older programming languages and systems were still in use because they were reliable and well understood. This aligns with the reality of enterprise computing, where COBOL and other legacy languages remain critical decades after being developed. Titer also discussed the internet. He said it would become less centralized, more fragmented. He mentioned that in his time, communities used localized networks rather than relying on massive global platforms. This has not fully occurred, but trends toward decentralized systems, mesh networks, and blockchain technologies reflect movement in that direction. Perhaps most unsettling were his social predictions. He described increasing distrust in institutions. He mentioned that people would become more self-sufficient, growing their own food and relying on local communities. He said media would fracture, with people choosing sources that aligned with their existing beliefs. These trends have accelerated dramatically since 2000. The rise of social media, the decline of traditional journalism, the growth of political polarization, and the emphasis on self-reliance and preparedness all align with Titer's descriptions. None of this is proof. Trends can be observed and extrapolated. A skilled futurist could make educated guesses. But the consistency of Titer's vision, particularly for someone writing in the year 2000, is striking. Chapter 4. The IBM connection, the single most compelling piece of evidence in the John Titer case, involves a computer manufactured in the 1970s. Titer claimed that his mission was to retrieve an IBM 5100 portable computer. This was not a random choice. He stated specifically that the IBM 5100 had a unique feature that was not publicly documented. The machine could emulate and translate older programming languages used in mainframe systems from the 1960s and 70s. This capability, he said, was critical in his time. Legacy systems in 2038 still relied on code written decades earlier, and the IBM 5100 was one of the few machines capable of debugging and translating that code. Without it, critical infrastructure would fail. In the year 2000, the IBM 5100 was an obscure piece of technology. Released in 1975, it was one of the first portable computers, though at £50, portability was relative. It was expensive, marketed primarily to businesses and engineers. By 2000, it was largely forgotten, a curiosity for vintage computing enthusiasts, but not widely discussed. Titer's claim about the undocumented feature seemed oddly specific. Why choose this particular computer? Why claim it had a secret capability? Years later, engineers who had worked on the IBM 5100 began to speak publicly. One of them was Bob Dubke, who confirmed in interviews that the machine did indeed have an undocumented emulation feature. It could read and translate code from older IBM mainframe systems, including those written in APL and BASIC. This capability was intentionally kept quiet. IBM did not advertise it because they did not want competitors to know. It was a feature built in for corporate clients who needed backward compatibility, but was not included in user manuals or marketing materials. The question becomes unavoidable. How did John Titor know this in the year 2000? If he was a hoaxer, he would have needed access to information that was not publicly available. He would have needed to speak with IBM engineers or find internal documentation. This is not impossible, but it requires assumptions about effort and access that seem inconsistent with an elaborate internet prank. One theory is that Titor was himself connected to IBM, either as an employee or as someone who had worked with vintage computing systems. Perhaps he stumbled upon this information through professional channels and decided to build a story around it. But if that were the case, why choose such an obscure detail? Why not pick something more dramatic, something that could be verified immediately and publicly? The IBM 5100 feature was not confirmed until years after Titor disappeared, when former engineers happened to mention it in interviews. It was not the kind of detail that would generate immediate attention. Another possibility is that Titor made a lucky guess. Perhaps he knew the IBM 5100 was used in legacy systems and speculated that it might have undocumented features. This is theoretically possible, but it requires an implausible level of coincidence. The most straightforward explanation is that Titor knew about the feature because he had access to information from IBM insiders. But even this raises questions. If he had such access, what was his motive? There was no book deal, no movie rights, no monetization of the story. He posted on obscure forums, engaged for 5 months, and disappeared. The IBM 5100 claim remains the strongest single piece of evidence in favour of Titor's authenticity. It is a verifiable fact that was stated before public confirmation. It is a detail that should not have been casually known. And yet, it was. Chapter 5. Vanishing without resolution. On March 24th, 2001, John Titor posted what would become his final message on the Time Travel Institute forum. The post was brief, professional and unremarkable. He thanked the community for their time and questions. He stated that he would be leaving. He did not specify where he was going or whether he intended to return. And then he was gone. No dramatic exit, no final revelation, no attempt to provide proof that would settle the debate once and for all. He simply stopped posting. The account went silent. The conversation continued without him. In the years that followed, researchers attempted to trace his identity. Investigators analysed his IP addresses, though the logs from that era are incomplete. Some claim the posts originated from Florida. Others suggested connections to Texas or California. No definitive location was ever confirmed. Linguistic analysis was conducted on his writing. Researchers looked for patterns, idiosyncrasies, anything that might match other known internet personas. Some believed they found similarities to entertainment lawyers or aspiring science fiction writers. Others argued the analysis was inconclusive. No one came forward to claim credit. This is unusual. Internet hoaxes typically unravel. Someone talks, someone wants recognition, someone cannot resist explaining how they fooled everyone. But with Titor, the silence persisted. In 2003, a woman claiming to be Titor's mother appeared briefly online. She posted under the name K. Titor and stated that her son had returned to his own time. She provided no proof. She engaged minimally with questions. After a short time, she also disappeared. The posts added little to the mystery. If genuine, they only confirmed what Titor had already said. If part of the hoax, they demonstrated remarkable restraint. Most hoaxers would have used such an opportunity to expand the story, to add new details or dramatic twists. Kay Titor did not. She simply stated that her son had left and that she missed him. Attempts to monetize the story came later, but not from Titor himself. In 2003, a book titled John Titor, A Time Traveller's Tale was published. It compiled his forum, posts along with commentary and analysis. The book was released by the John Titor Foundation, an entity with unclear origins. Some speculated that the foundation was created by the original hoaxer, now seeking to profit from the attention. Others believed it was an independent project by people fascinated by the story. The foundation has never revealed who controls it, or whether they have any connection to the original posts. Entertainment lawyer Larry Haber became associated with the foundation. He has represented the interests of the John Titor story in media negotiations and has been involved in discussions about potential film or television adaptations. Haber has never confirmed or denied whether he knows Titor's true identity. The involvement of a lawyer added fuel to skepticism. It suggested commercial motive, but it also raised questions. If the goal was profit, why wait years to monetize? Why not capitalize on the attention while it was at its peak? The delayed commercialization seemed inconsistent with a planned marketing campaign. Over the years, various individuals have been proposed as the real John Titor. Some have been investigated extensively. None have been definitively proven. The most compelling candidates have all denied involvement, and no evidence has emerged that conclusively links any individual to the posts. The mystery has persisted precisely because it has no clean resolution. There is no confession, no smoking gun, no moment where the curtain is pulled back and the truth is revealed. The case simply remains open, suspended in a state of permanent ambiguity. This lack of closure is itself unusual. It suggests either extraordinary discipline on the part of a hoaxer or the possibility that there is nothing to confess. Chapter 6. Parallel Timelines and Damage Control. One of the most sophisticated aspects of John Titor's narrative was his explanation of how time travel functioned. He did not describe a single fixed timeline where changes could create paradoxes. He described something far more complex and, intriguingly, more consistent with certain interpretations of modern physics. According to Titor, time travel did not occur along a single linear path. Instead, the universe consisted of infinite parallel world lines, each representing a slightly different version of reality. Every quantum event, every decision, every moment of chance created branching points where timelines diverged. When a time traveller moved backward or forward in time, they did not stay within their original world line. They shifted to a parallel one. The degree of divergence depended on the distance travelled. A short jump of a few years might result in a world line almost identical to the origin. A jump of decades would result in greater differences. Titor used a percentage system to describe divergence. He claimed his world line had approximately a 2% divergence from the year 2000 timeline he was visiting. This meant that major historical events were the same. World War II occurred. The Cold War happened. Technology developed along similar paths. But minor details differed. This framework had profound implications. It meant that paradoxes were impossible. If you travelled back in time and killed your grandfather, you would not cease to exist. You would simply be in a world line where you were never born. Your original world line would continue unchanged, still containing the version of you who travelled back. The model also explained why Titor's predictions could fail without disproving his story. If his world line diverged from ours, events that occurred in his timeline might not occur in ours. The civil war he described might happen in his world line but not in ours. CERN might discover micro-black holes in his world line but not in ours. This creates an unfalsifiable narrative. Any failed prediction can be attributed to timeline divergence rather than fraud. Critics argue this makes the story immune to disproof. Supporters argue it makes the story consistent with real theoretical physics. The many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, on which Titor's model was based, is a legitimate scientific framework. It was developed by Hugh Everett III in his doctoral thesis at Princeton in 1957. Everett proposed that the wave function never collapses. Instead, all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement occur, each in a separate branch of reality. This interpretation has been debated extensively. Some physicists embrace it because it avoids the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. Others reject it because it seems to violate Occam's razor by proposing an infinite number of unobservable universes. But the interpretation remains a valid solution to the equations of quantum mechanics. It is taught in university physics courses. It is discussed in peer-reviewed journals. It is not fringe science. Titor applied this framework to macroscopic time, travel. He suggested that the same branching that occurs at the quantum level occurs when traversing time. Each journey creates or accesses a new branch. This would have practical implications for time travellers. They could not use time travel to fix problems in their own timeline. They could gather information, retrieve objects, or observe historical events, but any intervention would only affect the new timeline they entered. Titer claimed that this was well understood in his era. Time travel was used for specific missions, primarily retrieval operations or reconnaissance. It was not used to prevent disasters because such prevention would only benefit alternate timelines, not the origin timeline. This pragmatic approach to time travel felt authentic. It lacked the grandiosity of most science fiction. It was not about saving the world or becoming a hero. It was about logistics, about obtaining specific resources or information under controlled conditions. The framework also provided a built-in explanation for why Titor could discuss future events without fear of changing them. Anything he said would only influence the timeline he was visiting, not his own. His timeline would continue on its path regardless of what he revealed. This created a strange ethical situation. Titer could warn people about future disasters, but those warnings would not save anyone in his timeline. They might save people in the new timeline, but his own loved ones, his own history, would remain unchanged. He acknowledged this in his posts. When asked why he did not try to prevent tragedies, he explained that it would be futile. He could prevent them here, but not there. And his mission parameters did not include intervention. This fatalistic acceptance felt real. It suggested someone who had thought deeply about the implications of time travel and had come to terms with its limitations. Chapter 7. Other cases that do not fit. John Titor is not the only person in history to claim foreknowledge of events or to exhibit information that seems temporally displaced. The historical record contains numerous accounts of individuals who described future technologies, predicted events, or possessed knowledge they should not have had. In 1932, a science fiction story called A Logic Named Joe was written by Murray Leinster. The story described a device that could access all human knowledge instantly, answer questions, and connect people across distances. It predicted the internet with remarkable accuracy, decades before computers were widely available. Was Leinster a time traveller? Almost certainly not. He was a skilled science fiction writer who extrapolated from existing trends. But the accuracy of his prediction demonstrates that foresight is possible without time travel. The question is always where the line exists between extrapolation and impossible knowledge. In 1950, a man named Rudolph Fentz allegedly appeared in New York City's Times Square and was struck by a car. According to the story, he was wearing 19th century clothing, carried old currency, and had no modern identification. Police investigated and supposedly found records of a man by that name who had disappeared in 1876. This story is compelling, but it was later revealed to be fiction. It originated in a short story published in Collier's magazine. The author Jack Finney wrote it as speculative fiction, not as a factual account. Over time, the story was repeated as if it were real, demonstrating how legends can emerge from creative work. The Fentz case is a cautionary tale. It shows how easily fiction can be mistaken for fact, especially when details are specific and the story has emotional resonance. It also shows why the Titer case is different. Titer's posts were not presented as fiction. They were presented as first-hand accounts, and they contained verifiable details that were later confirmed. In the 1980s and 90s, several individuals claimed to have knowledge of future events. Some described technological developments. Others predicted political changes or natural disasters. Most were wrong. A few were disturbingly accurate. In 1984, a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey predicted a series of global crises based on biblical prophecy. Many of the predictions failed, but some, particularly those related to Middle Eastern conflict and nuclear proliferation, aligned with later events. Was this foreknowledge or pattern recognition? The debate continues. In the early 2000s, anonymous posts began appearing on internet image boards, claiming knowledge of future events. Some predicted natural disasters. Others described economic collapses or political upheavals. Most were quickly forgotten. A few remain unsettling. In 2008, a post on a forum claimed that a major earthquake would strike Japan. In 2011, The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami devastated the region. The Post did not specify a date. It did not provide precise details, but it mentioned Japan, earthquakes, and nuclear consequences. The Fukushima nuclear disaster followed the earthquake. Skeptics note that Japan is an earthquake-prone region. Predicting an earthquake there is not remarkable, but the timing and the mention of nuclear consequences add a layer of specificity that is harder to dismiss as coincidence. In 2013, an anonymous user on an image board described a pandemic emerging from China that would spread globally and lead to widespread lockdowns. In 2019, such a pandemic began. The Post did not name a virus. It did not give a timeline. But the general framework matched. Again, pandemics are not unprecedented. Predicting one is not impossible. But the specific mention of China, the description of global response, and the timing raise questions. These cases do not prove time travel. They are anomalies in a sea of failed predictions. But they share a pattern with the Taita case. They involve information appearing before it logically should. They lack drama. They are not accompanied by grand claims. They simply state something, and later something similar occurs. If time travel were real and operated according to Taita's model, this is what the evidence would look like. Not definitive proof, not public demonstrations, just information, slightly misplaced, occasionally accurate, always deniable. Chapter 8. Government silence and plausible deniability. If time travel were possible, the question of why governments have not confirmed it becomes central. The answer may lie in the nature of the technology itself and the implications it would have for global stability. Time travel, if real, would represent the most significant strategic advantage in human history. It would dwarf nuclear weapons, surveillance systems, or any conventional military technology. A nation with time travel could observe enemy planning before it occurs, retrieve lost intelligence from historical archives, verify the accuracy of historical records, monitor the activities of rival nations in real time without detection, recover lost technologies or knowledge, understand the long-term consequences of policy decisions before implementing them. But these capabilities come with extraordinary risks. The potential for paradoxes, even in a many-worlds framework, could destabilize the fabric of reality. The economic implications would be catastrophic. If time travel were known to exist, markets would collapse. How could contracts be enforced if the past is not fixed? How could property rights be maintained? How could justice systems function? For these reasons, any government possessing time travel would maintain absolute secrecy. Disclosure would not be an option. Even limited acknowledgement would invite scrutiny, espionage, and destabilization. The technology would be compartmentalized, classified at the highest levels, and restricted to a small number of authorized personnel. This creates a problem for verification. If time travel is classified, there will be no public demonstrations, no congressional hearings, no freedom of information requests that yield results. The only evidence would be leaks, accidents, or individuals who travelled and chose to speak. John Titor fits this profile. He claimed to be a soldier on a sanctioned mission. He was not a rogue traveller or a whistleblower. He was operating, he said, within established protocols. His mission had specific parameters. He was retrieving a computer, visiting family, and observing the past. If the story were true, this is exactly how a controlled disclosure might occur. Not through official channels, which would be too risky, but through an individual who shared information in a format that was deniable. Internet forums in 2000 were perfect for this. They were obscure, loosely moderated, and easily dismissed as fiction. Titor's posts could be acknowledged without confirmation. Officials could dismiss them as creative writing. No investigation would be required. No resources would be allocated. The information would remain in the public domain, accessible to anyone curious enough to look but never validated. This approach provides plausible deniability. If questions arise, the answer is simple. It was a hoax, an elaborate internet story, entertainment, nothing more. But what if it was not? The strategic value of plausible deniability is immense. Information can be shared without risk. If the information proves useful to certain parties, it can be acted upon. If it proves inconvenient, it can be ignored. The source can be discredited without effort because the source has already discredited itself by claiming to be a time traveller. This is the perfect cover for a leak. It is information hiding in plain sight, protected by its own implausibility. Consider the alternative. If time travel exists and is classified, how else would information escape? Through official channels? Unlikely. Governments do not voluntarily disclose their most sensitive technologies. Through whistleblowers? Possible, but risky. Whistleblowers face prosecution, surveillance, and retaliation. An anonymous post on an obscure forum claiming to be from a time traveller would be dismissed immediately by most people. But it would also be preserved, archived, and accessible. It would enter the public consciousness without triggering a response from authorities. It would be the perfect method for getting information out without getting caught. Silence in this context is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of control. Governments that possess advanced technology do not announce it. They use it quietly, deny its existence publicly, and allow speculation to fill the void. The lack of official response to the Titer case is consistent with this model. No agency has investigated, no official has commented. The story remains in the realm of internet folklore, never quite debunked, never quite confirmed, and perhaps that is exactly the point. Chapter 9. The evidence that cannot be unseen. When all elements of the John Titor case are examined together, a pattern emerges that resists simple explanation. The individual components can be questioned, but the totality presents a more complex picture. The IBM 5100 claim is the most concrete piece of evidence. Titer stated years before public confirmation that the computer had an undocumented feature allowing it to emulate older programming languages. This was later verified by engineers who worked on the project. The probability of guessing this detail without insider knowledge is low. Skeptics propose that Titer had connections to IBM or to vintage computing communities where such information might have circulated informally. This is plausible. But it requires assumptions about access and motive that are not supported by evidence. If Titer had such connections, why use them for an elaborate internet hoax? What was the incentive? The technical knowledge displayed in Titer's post was consistent with real physics. His references to Kerr black holes, frame dragging, and the many worlds interpretation were accurate. He did not invent pseudoscience. He applied legitimate theoretical frameworks to speculative technology. This level of accuracy requires either formal education in physics or extensive self-study. It is not impossible for a hoaxer to possess such knowledge, but it raises questions about intent. Why invest significant effort into creating a scientifically accurate hoax that would only be appreciated by a small audience of physics enthusiasts? The timeline of Titer's activity is also significant. He appeared in late 2000, before social media existed. He posted on niche forums where visibility was limited. He did not seek viral attention. He did not attempt to monetize the story during his active period. This is inconsistent with typical hoax behavior, which tends to seek maximum exposure and profit. His departure was clean. He left without fanfare, without attempting to extend the story, and without providing final proof. Most hoaxers struggle with endings. They either escalate to maintain interest or collapse under scrutiny. Titer did neither. He simply stopped posting, as if completing a task and moving on. The consistency of his voice across hundreds of posts over 5 months is difficult to maintain. He answered technical questions, engaged with skeptics, and described daily life in his time without contradiction or escalation. This requires discipline and planning that seems excessive for a prank. The predictions Titer made were mixed. Some failed, some were vague, but some aligned with later events in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely. His descriptions of political polarization, institutional distrust, and social fragmentation have become increasingly accurate over time. None of this proves time travel. It does not even strongly suggest it. But it challenges the assumption that the case is easily explained. A hoax of this quality would require significant resources, knowledge, and restraint. It would require access to information that was not widely available, and it would require a motive that remains unclear. The alternative explanations all have weaknesses. The collaborative project theory requires coordination among multiple individuals who never came forward. The IBM insider theory requires motive and access that were never demonstrated. The physics enthusiast theory requires expertise and effort that seem disproportionate to the outcome. What remains is a pattern. Information that appeared too early, technical details that matched reality, a framework that anticipated later developments, and a disappearance that left no loose ends. The evidence does not compel belief, but it does compel attention. Chapter 10. If time travel is real. Assume, for the sake of exploration, that time travel is not only theoretically possible but practically achieved. What would such a reality look like? How would it manifest? And most importantly, how would it remain hidden? The first principle is secrecy. Any government or organisation possessing time travel technology would classify it at the highest level. It would not be shared with allies. It would not be acknowledged in budget documents. It would not be discussed in congressional hearings or public forums. The compartmentalisation would be absolute. Personnel with access would be limited. Missions would be highly specific, with narrow objectives and strict protocols. Time travellers would not wander freely through history. They would be sent to retrieve specific objects, verify specific information, or observe specific events. Deviation from mission parameters would be prohibited. Communication protocols would be carefully controlled. Travellers would not be allowed to make dramatic announcements. They would not contact media. They would not attempt to influence major historical events. Any interaction with the past or present would be conducted with minimal footprint. If a traveller wanted to leave a trace, they would need to do so in a way that was deniable. An anonymous internet post presented as speculative fiction or creative writing would be ideal. It would allow information to enter the public domain without triggering official response. It would be dismissed by most as entertainment while remaining accessible to those curious enough to investigate. This is precisely the model John Titor followed. Whether intentional or coincidental, his approach aligns with how a controlled disclosure might occur. Information was shared, details were provided, questions were answered, but nothing was provable. The story remained in the liminal space between fact and fiction. If time travel operates according to the many worlds model Titor described, travellers would have even less incentive to prove their claims. Any attempt to convince people in a destination timeline would be futile, because it would not benefit their origin timeline. They could share information, but they could not save their own world by doing so. This creates a strange ethical landscape. A time traveller could warn about future disasters, but those warnings would only help alternate timelines. Their own timeline would remain on its predetermined path. The only logical reason to share information would be curiosity, documentation, or a sense of obligation to other versions of humanity. Titor exhibited this fatalism in his posts. When asked why he did not try harder to convince people or prevent tragedies, he explained that it would not change his timeline. He could affect this world line, but not his own. His mission was retrieval, not intervention. This attitude felt authentic. It lacked the urgency of most time travel narratives. There was no ticking clock, no world to save, just a task to complete and information to share with people who might or might not believe it. If time travel is real, the present is not private. Every moment, every decision, every conversation could potentially be observed by individuals from the future. History would not be sealed. It would be permeable, accessible to those with the technology to reach it. This has profound implications. It means the past is not fixed in the sense of being unobserved. It means that records, documents, and events could be verified or retrieved by future historians with unprecedented accuracy. It means that lies, cover-ups, and hidden truths could eventually be exposed, not by contemporary investigators, but by travellers from centuries ahead. It also means that the present could be monitored. Future governments could send observers to key moments in history, watching events unfold, gathering intelligence, and understanding the long-term consequences of decisions. These observers would blend in. They would not announce themselves. They would simply watch. Titor claimed that time travel was used this way in his era. Missions were launched to observe historical events, retrieve lost information, and verify records. The technology was not used frivolously. It was too dangerous and too valuable, but it was used strategically for purposes that benefited the origin timeline even if they could not change it. If this is true, the implications are staggering. It means we are not alone in time. It means the future is watching. And it means that the evidence of that observation might already be here, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. Chapter 11. Patterns across decades. The John Titor case did not emerge in a vacuum. It is part of a broader pattern of temporal anomalies that have appeared throughout history, each raising similar questions about information that seems displaced in time. In the 1920s, inventor Nikola Tesla described technologies that would not be realized for decades. He spoke of wireless energy transmission, concepts that foreshadowed modern attempts at wireless power transfer. He described devices that could photograph thoughts, predating brain-computer interfaces. He mentioned the possibility of communicating with other planets, a concept that seemed absurd at the time, but is now within the realm of serious scientific discussion. Was Tesla a time traveller? No credible evidence suggests this, but his ability to envision technologies far ahead of his time demonstrates that exceptional foresight is possible. The question is always whether such foresight comes from genius, from extrapolation, or from something else entirely. In 1945, the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke published a technical paper describing the use of geostationary satellites for global communication. At the time, satellites did not exist. Rockets barely existed. The idea seemed fantastical. By the 1960s, his vision was reality. Clarke was not a time traveller. He was an engineer and writer who understood physics and extrapolated brilliantly. But Clarke's accuracy raises an important point. Accurate prediction is possible. The challenge is distinguishing between prediction and foreknowledge. Titor's case becomes interesting not because prediction is impossible, but because certain specific details seem to exceed the boundaries of reasonable extrapolation. In the 1950s and 60s, military projects explored concepts that sound like science fiction. Project Blue Book investigated UFO sightings. The Stargate project studied remote viewing. The Philadelphia experiment, though likely a myth, captured public imagination with claims of teleportation and time manipulation. These projects, whether real or exaggerated, demonstrate that governments have invested in research at the edges of known science. If time travel research occurred, it would fit this pattern. It would be classified, compartmentalized, and surrounded by disinformation. The public would hear rumours. Some would be true, most would be false. The truth would be buried in a mixture of fact and fiction, making verification nearly impossible. In the 1980s, a man named Al Bielek claimed to have participated in time travel experiments as part of a secret government project. He described being sent to the year 2049 and witnessing a devastated Earth. His claims were never verified. Most researchers dismissed them as fabrication or delusion. But Bielek's story shares structural similarities with Titor's: government involvement, specific missions, and descriptions of a troubled future. The difference is in the details. Bielek's account lacks the technical specificity of Titor's. It contains contradictions and dramatic elements that feel more like storytelling than reporting. Titor's account, by contrast, was measured, consistent and procedural. In the two thousands, after Titor disappeared, others began claiming time travel experiences. None achieved the same level of credibility. Most were quickly debunked or ignored. This suggests that if Titor was a hoax, it was an unusually sophisticated one. If he was genuine, subsequent claimants were either frauds capitalizing on his fame or less skilled travellers. The pattern across these cases is inconsistent. Some involve genuine prediction, some involve fraud, some remain unexplained. But taken together, they suggest that the idea of temporal displacement has captured human imagination persistently and across cultures. Titor's case stands apart not because it proves time travel, but because it resists the easy categorization that applies to other cases. It is not obviously fraud, it It is not obviously genius prediction. It occupies a middle space that invites investigation while refusing resolution. Chapter 12. The technology that might exist if we accept, for the sake of argument, that time travel is theoretically possible under the laws of physics. What would the technology actually look like? And is there any evidence that such technology is being developed? The physics of time travel, as understood today, relies on solutions to Einstein's field equations that allow for closed time-like curves. These solutions exist under specific conditions, such as near-rotating black holes, within wormholes stabilized by exotic matter, or in spacetimes with unusual topologies. The Kerr metric describing rotating black holes is the most well-known solution. As Tito described, a Kerr black hole has properties that theoretically allow for time travel. An object entering the ergosphere could, under certain conditions, emerge at a different point in time. The challenge is creating and controlling such an environment on a scale that allows for human travel. Micro-black holes, which Titer claimed were generated by his device, are theoretically possible. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN was partially designed to test whether such black holes could be created in high-energy particle collisions. None have been detected, but theoretical models suggest they could exist if extra dimensions of space are real. Creating stable micro-black holes and using them for time travel would require technologies far beyond current capabilities. It would require exotic matter with negative energy density, a concept that exists in quantum field theory but has never been produced in macroscopic quantities. It would require containment systems capable of managing gravitational forces that could otherwise tear apart any surrounding structure. Yet research continues in these areas. Experiments with Casimir effects, quantum field manipulation, and high-energy physics push the boundaries of what is understood. If time travel technology were being developed, it would likely emerge from research in these fields. Governments do not typically announce breakthroughs in strategic technologies. The development of nuclear weapons occurred in secret. Stealth aircraft were operational for years before public acknowledgement. Surveillance technologies exist that are only revealed through leaks or declassification decades later. If time travel were achieved, it would follow this pattern. Development would occur in classified programs. Testing would be conducted in secure locations. Operational use would be limited to specific missions with strict controls, and public knowledge would be managed through denial and disinformation. Titer's description of his temporal displacement unit included elements that are consistent with theoretical requirements. He mentioned particle accelerators, magnetic containment, gravitational sensors, and cooling systems. These are not invented components. They are real technologies used in high-energy physics. The scale he described, a device weighing approximately 500 pounds that could fit in a vehicle, is extraordinarily ambitious. Current particle accelerators are massive, occupying kilometres of underground tunnels. Miniaturization to the extent Titer described would require breakthroughs in superconducting materials, energy density and field containment. But breakthroughs occur. Technologies that seem impossible become practical. In 1945, the idea of a computer fitting in your pocket would have seemed absurd. In 1960, the idea of global instant communication through handheld devices would have been science fiction. Today, both are mundane. If time travel research has been ongoing since the mid-20th century, as some conspiracy theories suggest, then by 2038, significant advances could have occurred. Titer's device, implausible by 2000 standards, might be achievable by future standards. The absence of public evidence does not mean the technology does not exist. It means, at most, that it has not been publicly acknowledged. And if strategic considerations demand secrecy, public acknowledgement might never occur. Epilogue. The future watching the past. In the decades since John Titer's final post, the internet has transformed. Social media platforms have billions of users. Information spreads instantly. Anonymity is increasingly difficult, and yet the Titer case endures. Researchers continue to analyse his posts. New generations discover the story and attempt their own investigations. Theories proliferate. Some believe they have solved the mystery. Others insist it remains unsolvable. The conversation never quite ends. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is not what Tita said, but what he represents. If time travel is real, the future is not a distant abstraction. It is a place populated by people who can reach back and interact with us subtly and deniably. Every word written online is archived, every decision documented, every pattern recorded. If travellers from the future can access these archives, they can study us with precision that no contemporary observer could match. They can understand our mistakes, our innovations, our moments of crisis and triumph. And if they chose to leave messages, those messages would likely look like fiction. They would be buried in forums, dismissed as creative writing, ignored by most and studied by a few. They would be information hiding in plain sight, protected by their own implausibility. Tita claimed that in his time travel was known but not publicised. It was a tool used by governments and militaries for specific purposes. Travellers blended in. They did not announce themselves. They completed their missions and returned home. If this is true, we are not alone in time. We are observed, documented, and possibly influenced in ways we do not recognise. The past is not sealed. The present is not private. And the future is not unknowable. The evidence for this is not conclusive. It is suggestive. It is a pattern of details that do not quite fit, information that arrives too early, and explanations that resist simple dismissal. John Tita may have been a hoax, a skilled writer with access to obscure information and a talent for consistency. A project by multiple collaborators who never broke ranks. An exercise in creative fiction that happened to align with later events through coincidence. Or he may have been exactly what he claimed, a soldier from 2038, sent back to retrieve a computer, who chose to share information with a small online community before returning to his own time. The evidence does not compel a conclusion, but it does compel consideration. The future does not need us to believe it. It only needs us to notice it. And if time travel is real, the proof is already here. We just have to decide whether we are ready to see it. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us, and if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into it. They say power whispers, but in the California redwoods, beneath trees that have stood for centuries, power doesn't need to speak at all. It simply gathers and waits. Part 1. The recording. The camera was hidden in a hollowed-out book. Alex had carried it for 3 miles through the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every snapped twig beneath his boots felt like a gunshot. Every shadow between the towering redwoods seemed to shift and watch. It was mid-July in the year 2000, and Alex Jones had just done something most journalists only fantasized about. He had infiltrated Bohemian Grove. The fence had been easier to climb than expected. No electric wire, no guards with dogs, just chain link and darkness and the smell of California pine heavy in the summer air. He'd studied satellite photos for weeks, memorised the layout, waited until the first night of the encampment when security would be focused inward, not out. The reconnaissance had taken months. Alex had spoken with former employees, kitchen staff who'd signed non-disclosure agreements, maintenance workers who'd seen things they couldn't legally discuss. Each conversation had been careful, coded. One former groundskeeper had drawn a map on a napkin in a diner outside Monterio, then burned it in the ashtray before leaving. Another had simply said, "First Saturday night, after dark, stay in the trees." Now he crouched behind a massive redwood trunk watching. The bark pressed against his back, rough and ancient. Somewhere in the distance an owl, a real one, called out into the night. The sound seemed like a warning. Through the trees he could see firelight, hear voices, low, rhythmic, chanting. The sound rolled through the grove like distant thunder, raising goosebumps along his arms despite the warm night. It wasn't the words that unsettled him. He couldn't make those out yet, but the tone, the unified cadence of dozens of voices speaking as one. He pressed record. The camera captured what most of the world would never see. Dozens of figures in dark robes gathering in a clearing. At the centre stood something that didn't belong in any California forest. A stone owl towering 40 feet high, its blank eyes reflecting the flames below. The owl's face was impassive, carved with an almost Egyptian quality. Ancient, knowing, indifferent to human concerns. The ceremony was called the Cremation of Care. Alex didn't know that yet. He only knew that some of the most powerful men in America were standing in the darkness, wearing hoods, chanting at a stone idol while something burned in an effigy at its base. The effigy was human-shaped, wrapped in fabric, suspended above the flames by chains. As it burned, the chanting grew louder. His voice echoed across the clearing, amplified, theatrical, speaking in archaic language about casting off the burden of conscience, about freedom from responsibility, about 2 weeks of pure indulgence without guilt. Alex's finger stayed on the record button, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He filmed for 17 minutes before he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy boots on forest floor, multiple people, moving with purpose. Security had spotted him, or someone had reported movement in the restricted zone. When he finally escaped back over that fence, footage secured, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely drive. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. He didn't stop at the motel where he'd been staying. He drove straight through, 5 hours back to the Bay Area, checking his rearview mirror every 30 seconds. The video would be uploaded within days, and the question it raised was simple, haunting, and impossible to fully answer. Why do the world's most powerful men gather in total secrecy to perform rituals in the woods? Part 2, The Beginning. 128 years earlier, in 1872, 5 men sat in a San Francisco tavern and decided to start a club. They were writers, journalists, artists, men who valued culture over commerce, poetry over profit. They called themselves bohemians, wanderers, freethinkers, people who rejected the rigid social structures of Gilded Age America. The founding members were modest in means but ambitious in spirit. Henry Edwards, a journalist for the San Francisco Examiner. James Bowman, a struggling painter whose landscapes never sold. Joseph Redding, a poet whose work appeared in small literary magazines nobody read. They met in cheap taverns, rented rooms above bakeries for meetings, staged plays in borrowed theatres. The Bohemian Club was born from good intentions. Their motto, borrowed from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was elegant. Weaving spiders come not here. It meant business and politics were forbidden. Only art mattered, only creativity, only the meeting of minds unchained from the pursuit of wealth. For 27 years it stayed that way. The club met in the city. They performed plays, read poetry, debated philosophy. Membership was exclusive but modest. Journalists who couldn't afford lavish lifestyles, painters who worked in cramped studios, musicians who played for passion instead of pay. Annual dues were kept low deliberately to ensure artists could afford to participate. Then, in 1899, everything changed. The club purchased 2,700 acres of ancient redwood forest north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. The money came from a wealthy patron, an industrialist, named William Crocker, whose father had built the Central Pacific Railroad. Crocker wasn't an artist, he was a banker, but he appreciated culture, or so he said, and he wanted to support the club's vision. They called it Bohemian Grove. The first summer encampment was held that same year. 2 weeks of camping, drinking, performing plays beneath the trees. Members slept in tents, cooked over campfires, staged elaborate theatrical productions on outdoor stages they built themselves. It was supposed to be an escape, a place where creative souls could breathe. But money always follows beauty, and power always follows money. Within 5 years, the membership had shifted. Bankers joined, claiming an appreciation for the arts. Railroad executives attended performances and asked to become members. Oil magnates from Southern California heard about the Grove and requested invitations. The artists noticed, of course. They complained in private letters, in journal entries that would be discovered decades later. One founding member wrote, "We built a sanctuary from wealth, and wealth has followed us here. They dress as we do, speak as we do, but they are not us. They are tourists in our world." But the club needed money. Maintaining 2,700 acres of pristine forest wasn't cheap, and the wealthy patrons were generous. They funded new cabins, improved facilities, hired staff to manage the property. All they asked in return was membership, access. The artists told themselves it would be fine, that the motto still mattered, that business and politics would still be banned. They were wrong. Part 3. When the poets left. By 1905, the membership roles had shifted completely. Where there had once been struggling writers, there were now railroad tycoons. Where there had been painters, there were now bankers. Industrialists joined, oil magnates, men whose decisions shaped markets, cities, entire regions. The original artists didn't leave immediately. They stayed, watching their club transform around them. Some adapted, finding wealthy patrons among the new members. Others grew bitter, attending less frequently, until they stopped coming altogether. A few died, their obituaries noting their founding membership in the Bohemian Club, a detail that meant less with each passing year. The motto remained the same: "Weaving spiders come not here." But everyone knew it had become a lie. The business deals happened anyway, just quietly. A railroad executive and a mining company owner would take a walk through the forest discussing land rights. A banker and a politician would share drinks by the campfire talking about legislation. No formal contracts were signed at the Grove. That would violate the spirit of the motto. But understandings were reached, handshakes were exchanged, partnerships were formed. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. Herbert Hoover attended regularly, years before becoming president. He was Secretary of Commerce at the time, and the Grove gave him access to the titans of American industry in an informal setting. Decisions that might take months of official meetings in Washington could be sketched out over a weekend in the Redwoods. Dwight Eisenhower was a regular guest in the 40s and 50s. A Supreme Allied commander during World War II, he'd become accustomed to making decisions of global consequence. The Grove offered something different, a place to network with the civilian leadership that controlled defence budgets, manufacturing capacity, political support. Richard Nixon came repeatedly throughout his career. He'd first attended in the late 40s, shortly after being elected to Congress. The Grove was where he made the connections that would carry him to the vice presidency, then the presidency, then ultimately to resignation in disgrace. But even after Watergate, even after his political career had ended, he maintained his membership. Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Henry Kissinger, military leaders, intelligence officials, CEOs of companies that controlled more wealth than most nations. The list reads like a shadow government, and perhaps that's exactly what it was. The Bohemian Grove had evolved. It was no longer a retreat for artists. It was a gathering place for the architects of American power. And what happened there? What was discussed? What was decided? What was agreed upon in hushed conversations between men who shaped policy and war and economy remained locked behind walls of absolute secrecy. Part 4. The Manhattan Project. September 1942. The world was at war. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe, occupying France, bombing London into rubble, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Imperial Japan controlled the Pacific from mainland China to the Philippines. America had been pulled into the conflict less than a year earlier, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still scrambling to mobilize an economy that had spent the previous decade in depression. That September, during the Bohemian Grove's annual encampment, a meeting occurred that would change human history. Present were some of the most brilliant scientific minds in America. Ernest Lawrence, a physicist who had invented the cyclotron and would win the Nobel Prize. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley who spoke 6 languages and quoted Hindu scripture. Military officials whose names remain partially classified to this day, men who understood strategy and logistics and the brutal mathematics of total war. The meeting happened in a camp called Chowder and Marching Society. It wasn't a public gathering, no stage, no audience, no theatrical performance. Just a dozen men in a cabin talking late into the night. They drank scotch. They smoked cigarettes. They discussed the possibility of building a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The physics was theoretical but promising. German scientists had discovered nuclear fission in 1938. Jewish physicists fleeing the Nazis had brought that knowledge to America, along with a terrifying certainty. If they could figure out how to weaponize atomic energy, so could Hitler. The question wasn't whether to build the bomb. The question was how quickly it could be done, and whether America could do it before Germany. No official minutes were recorded, no transcripts exist. But historians have confirmed the meeting happened. Lawrence's personal papers mention the Grove gathering. Oppenheimer's biographers reference conversations that took place there. Military records show that key personnel were granted leave to attend the encampment that year, despite wartime restrictions on travel. Shortly afterward, within weeks, the Manhattan Project was formally accelerated. Funding increased exponentially. Personnel expanded from dozens to thousands. Facilities were built in secret locations: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The secret program to develop atomic weapons shifted into high gear. Conspiracy theorists point to this and ask a simple question. Did they plan the atomic bomb at Bohemian Grove? The answer is more complicated than yes or no. They didn't design the bomb there. The physics was developed in labs, the engineering in Los Alamos, the uranium enrichment in massive facilities that required industrial infrastructure. But the decision to move forward, the political will, the strategic coordination between military and scientific leadership, the allocation of resources on a scale never before attempted, may have crystallized in those private conversations beneath the redwoods. Think about what that means. The most consequential weapon in human history, the device that would kill hundreds of thousands at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the technology that would define global politics for the next 80 years. Its development may have been accelerated by conversations held at a private men's club, away from congressional oversight, away from public debate, away from any democratic process. No oversight, no press, no records, just power, talking to power, deciding the fate of the world over whiskey and campfire smoke. Part 5. The Owl. The stone owl stands at the edge of a small lake called Mirror Lake, 40 feet tall, carved from concrete and stone, its wings spread wide, its eyes empty and unblinking. The construction is crude by modern standards. The owl looks less like a majestic bird and more like an ancient idol, something that might be discovered in ruins of a forgotten civilization. At its base is a shrine, an altar where the cremation of care ceremony takes place every summer. The ritual happens on the first Saturday night of the encampment. Members are informed of the time through word of mouth. No printed schedules, no announcements. As sunset approaches, men begin gathering at their camps, changing into robes. Each camp has its own colour: red, black, green, brown. The robes are simple, hooded, monastic. By nightfall, hundreds of robed figures form a procession through the trees. They carry torches, real fire, not electric lights. The procession is silent except for the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The path winds through the grove for nearly a mile before reaching Mirror Lake. The owl looms above them, lit from below by carefully positioned floodlights that make it appear even larger, more imposing. The lake reflects everything: the owl, the torches, the gathering crowd, creating the illusion of two ceremonies, one above and one below, mirror images in an ancient rite. When the procession is complete, the ceremony begins. It's elaborate, professionally produced. A sound system hidden in the trees broadcasts music, orchestral, dramatic, specifically composed for this ritual. There's narration delivered by a voice that booms across the water with theatrical gravitas. The narration tells a story. Care, the burden of conscience, arrives at the grove seeking to ruin the members' enjoyment. The owl, representing wisdom, representing the ancient knowledge that transcends human morality, rejects care, condemns it, orders it destroyed. Care is represented by a human-shaped effigy, suspended by chains above a pyre at the owl's base. As the narration reaches its climax, the effigy is lowered into the flames. It burns for several minutes while the robed figures watch in silence. The message is clear. For the next 2 weeks, these men are free from the burden of responsibility, free from guilt, free from the weight of their decisions. Care means worry, responsibility, conscience, guilt. The ceremony represents shedding those burdens. Officially, it's described as harmless theatre, a tradition dating back to the early 1920s, created by a member who was a professional theatre director. A way for powerful men to relax and forget the weight of their decisions. Nothing more than elaborate performance art, a bit of pageantry to mark the beginning of the encampment. But symbolism matters. When you tell the world's most influential leaders that they can, symbolically, ritually, burn away their sense of responsibility, what are you really doing? When CEOs who make decisions affecting thousands of employees watch care burn, what message do they receive? When politicians who control military budgets see conscience destroyed by fire, what permission are they being given? When generals who order troops into combat participate in a ritual that explicitly celebrates freedom from moral burden, what does that say about the wars they'll wage? Are you helping them relax? Or are you giving them permission? The owl is Minerva, they say, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is about wisdom transcending worry, about strategic thinking unencumbered by emotion. But Minerva was also the goddess of warfare, and wisdom without conscience is just calculation. Part 6. Nixon's Tape. August 1971. President Richard Nixon was in the Oval Office speaking with his Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman. The conversation was recorded, as all conversations in Nixon's White House were, captured by the secret taping system that would eventually destroy his presidency. They were discussing the Bohemian Grove. The context is important. Nixon and Haldeman were talking about campaign strategy for the upcoming election. They'd been reviewing potential donors, discussing who to court, who to invite to White House dinners. Someone, the tape doesn't make clear who, had suggested reaching out to Bohemian Grove members. Nixon's response was immediate and visceral. The Bohemian Grove, I won't go into it, but it's the most effing goddamn thing you could ever imagine. The profanity was unusual for Nixon on tape. He cursed occasionally, but this was emphatic, emotional, the kind of language people use when describing something that genuinely disturbed them. He refused to elaborate. The recording cuts to a different topic, something about fundraising in California, details that seemed trivial compared to what had just been said. Whatever Nixon meant, whatever he saw or experienced or understood about the Grove, he never explained publicly. The comment was discovered years later during the Watergate investigation, buried in hours of White House recordings that were being analysed for evidence of obstruction of justice. People still debate what he meant. Was he disgusted by something he witnessed? Nixon had attended the Grove multiple times throughout his political career. He'd participated in the cremation of care ceremony. He'd networked with the members, built the relationships that would carry him to the presidency. But his comment suggested something more than simple distaste for theatre. Was he impressed in a way that troubled him? The phrase, "most goddamn thing you could imagine," could mean extraordinary, overwhelming beyond normal experience. Perhaps he'd seen the true extent of the power concentrated in those woods, and it had shaken something in him. Was he horrified? Nixon was many things, calculating, paranoid, ruthless when necessary, but he wasn't immune to moral consideration. The Watergate scandal showed his capacity for wrongdoing, but the tapes also showed a man who sometimes agonized over decisions, who understood the weight of presidential power. Perhaps something at the Grove had crossed a line he didn't want to discuss. Was he amused in a dark way? Nixon had a cynical streak. Maybe he found the whole thing absurd. Powerful men playing dress-up, performing elaborate rituals, taking themselves so seriously. But if it was just silly theatre, why refuse to explain it? The ambiguity is the point. If Bohemian Grove was just a social club, just a place where old men dressed up and performed silly rituals, why did the President of the United States refuse to describe it? What was he protecting? Or what was he afraid to reveal? Haldeman, for his part, never elaborated either. Years later, after serving time for his role in Watergate, he was occasionally asked about the Grove in interviews. He always deflected, changed the subject, or said simply, "It's a private club, members don't discuss it." But the tape remains. Nixon's voice, recorded without his knowledge, preserved for history. A sitting president in the privacy of the Oval Office, describing something he'd personally witnessed as the most goddamn thing you could imagine, and then refusing to explain what that meant. Part 7. The Rules. Bohemian Grove operates under rules so strict they resemble military classification protocols. The official rulebook is short, just a few pages, but every word is enforced absolutely. Violations lead to immediate expulsion. No appeals, no exceptions. Members who've belonged for decades have been banned for single infractions. No press allowed, ever. Not mainstream media, not independent journalists, not documentary filmmakers. No exceptions. Reporters who've attempted to enter have been detained by private security, sometimes turned over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. The club's lawyers are aggressive about prosecution. No recording devices, cameras, phones, audio equipment, all banned. Members are expected to surrender electronics at entry, or leave them locked in cars. Some camps conduct electronic sweeps to ensure compliance. The prohibition is taken so seriously that even senior members have been expelled for photographing their own camp areas. No wives or female guests. The Grove is exclusively male. Women are not permitted on the grounds during the encampment, with the exception of a handful of staff members who serve meals and clean cabins. Even female family members of members, daughters, mothers, sisters, are prohibited. The only women allowed are those working in service positions. This rule in particular has generated criticism. Why exclude women entirely? The official explanation is tradition, a preservation of the club's original all-male culture. But critics point out that excluding half the population from a space where policy is discussed and power is consolidated effectively excludes women from certain networks of influence. No public statements. What happens at the Grove stays at the Grove. Members who violate this rule face permanent expulsion. The prohibition extends beyond just talking to press. Members are expected not to discuss Grove matters with anyone, including family members. There are stories of wives who never knew their husbands attended, who discovered the membership only after death when dealing with estate paperwork. There are accounts of children who grew up unaware their fathers disappeared for 2 weeks every July, told only that it was a business retreat or camping trip. Staff sign non-disclosure agreements that extend for decades. Even after leaving employment, they are legally bound not to discuss what they've seen or heard. The NDAs include substantial financial penalties for violations, amounts large enough to bankrupt most working-class people. Some former staff have reported receiving legal threats years after leaving, when the club suspected they might be considering talking to journalists. A former kitchen worker interviewed anonymously in the late 90s said, "I worked there for 3 summers. I saw things, heard things, but I signed papers saying I'd never discuss it, and those papers don't expire. Ever. They made that very clear." Conspiracy theorists argue that this level of secrecy exceeds anything necessary for a social club. If it's just theatre, just rich men playing dress-up in the woods, why the ironclad silence? Why the NDAs? Why the absolute prohibition on documentation? The official answer is privacy. Powerful people deserve a place to relax without scrutiny. Public figures, politicians, CEOs, generals, live under constant observation. Every word is analysed, every action is recorded, every decision is debated. The Grove offers freedom from that burden, a place to be human, to make mistakes, to speak without calculation. That answer would be more convincing if the Grove welcomed documentation that could prove its innocence. If rituals are harmless, why not allow filming? If conversations are purely social, why ban note-taking? If nothing illegal or unethical occurs, why threaten legal action against anyone who discusses what happens there? Privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. Privacy protects individuals from unwanted intrusion. Secrecy protects actions from accountability. The Grove's rules are designed for secrecy. Part 8. The Camps. Bohemian Grove is divided into more than 100 smaller camps, each with its own name, character and membership. Mandalay, Hillbillies, Caveman, Stowaway, Isle of Aves, Silverado Squatters, Lost Angels, Owl's Nest. The names range from whimsical to pretentious, but the hierarchy is real. Some camps are more prestigious than others. Some are older, more connected to power. Membership in certain camps is a signal of status within the Grove's internal social structure. Mandalay is considered the most elite. Its members have included multiple presidents, defense secretaries, Supreme Court justices. The camp is located in a prime spot within the Grove, close to the lake, surrounded by old-growth redwoods. The cabins are larger, better appointed. When members give lakeside talks, a daily tradition at the Grove, Mandalay members are given prime speaking slots. Hillbillies is another high-status camp with a membership that leans toward business leaders. CEOs of major corporations, private equity executives, venture capitalists. The camp throws elaborate parties, brings in expensive whiskey, hires musicians to perform. Caveman, despite its primitive name, is equally prestigious. Military leaders, intelligence officials, defense contractors. The camp has a reputation for serious conversations about national security, geopolitics, strategic planning. Lower status camps exist on the periphery of the Grove, housed in smaller cabins, with memberships that include newly inducted members, younger executives still building their careers, academics and artists who provide intellectual credibility but less practical power. Members spend their 2 weeks rotating between camps, attending lakeside talks, watching theatrical performances, drinking heavily, and most importantly, talking. The daily schedule at the Grove is structured but flexible. Mornings begin with breakfast at individual camps. Then members gather at the lakeside for talks, informal presentations on various topics, given by members or invited guests. Topics range from politics to technology to philosophy. Past speakers have included sitting presidents, Nobel Prize winners, top scientists. Afternoons are for socializing. Members wander between camps, join impromptu discussions, take walks through the forest. This is when the real networking happens. CEOs sit beside generals on fallen logs, discussing defense contracts. Politicians share drinks with intelligence officials, talking about foreign policy. Corporate executives have breakfast with Supreme Court justices, mentioning cases that might affect their businesses. Evenings bring theatrical performances on the Grove's outdoor stages. Productions are elaborate, professionally designed, performed by members who've rehearsed for months. Some are comedies, some are dramas, some are musical revues. The quality varies, but the attendance is mandatory, a way to ensure all members gather together at least once daily. Late nights are for drinking and deeper conversations. This is when guards are lowered, when the formal structure dissolves, when friendships are cemented and alliances are formed. There are no aides present, no assistants, no one taking notes, no transcripts, no oversight, just conversation. And here's where conspiracy theories find their footing. In 1953, shortly after a Bohemian Grove encampment, the CIA launched Operation Ajax, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran and installing the Shah. Multiple attendees of that summer's Grove gathering were directly involved in planning the coup. Allen Dulles, CIA director, Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA officer who ran the operation on the ground, executives from oil companies that would benefit enormously from Iranian oil concessions. Coincidence? The official story is that Operation Ajax was planned in CIA headquarters, approved through proper channels, executed by trained operatives, and that's true. But the will to proceed, the decision that regime change was acceptable, that democracy could be sacrificed for strategic interests, may have been reinforced by conversations at the Grove. In 1967, energy policy discussions at the Grove preceded major shifts in American oil strategy. Executives from companies that profited enormously from those shifts were present. Within months, federal regulations changed, opening new areas for drilling, reducing environmental restrictions, providing tax benefits for oil production. Coincidence? Policy doesn't change in a vacuum. Someone has to advocate for it, someone has to convince legislators, someone has to coordinate between industry and government. The Grove provided a space for those conversations to happen informally, away from congressional hearings, away from public scrutiny. In 1989, defense contractors who attended the Grove saw their contracts renewed and expanded under the next administration. Many of those contractors had been camping alongside future cabinet members, sharing drinks, discussing the importance of military readiness, arguing for increased defense spending. Coincidence? In 2001, weeks after that summer's Grove encampment, the September 11th attacks occurred. The response, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the expansion of surveillance powers, the increase in defense and intelligence budgets, benefited many Grove members. Was the specific attack foreseeable? No. But the broader policy framework that enabled the response, the prioritization of security over liberty, the willingness to wage preemptive war, had been discussed at the Grove for years. Coincidence? No one can prove coordination. But the proximity, the casual, unrecorded mingling of people who later make decisions that align perfectly, raises questions that are impossible to dismiss entirely. Part 9. The Infiltrators. Alex Jones wasn't the first person to try to expose Bohemian Grove. He was just the first to bring back video. Before him, journalists had attempted to breach the perimeter. Most were caught, detained, and escorted off the property with threats of legal action. A few managed to observe from a distance but saw nothing conclusive. The Grove's security was professional, experienced, thorough. In 1989, a team of activists from San Francisco attempted a coordinated infiltration. They planned for months, studying the layout, timing their approach for maximum confusion during the opening ceremony. 3 people made it over the fence. All 3 were caught within 30 minutes, detained in a security building, then handed over to local law enforcement on trespassing charges. They spent the night in jail. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message was clear. The Grove was protected. In the mid-90s, a freelance journalist named Rick posed as a service worker. He managed to get hired on kitchen staff, passed the background check, signed the NDA. He worked for 4 days before someone recognized him from a previous article he'd written about elite clubs. He was escorted off property immediately, threatened with a lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. The lawsuit never materialised. The club likely didn't want the publicity, but Rick's notes and recordings were confiscated. In 2000, Alex Jones succeeded because he was brazen. He didn't sneak in like a spy. He walked in like he belonged. He studied how members moved, how they dressed, what they carried. On the night of the cremation of care ceremony, he simply walked through an entrance gate during a shift change, moving with purpose, looking like he had every right to be there. Security at the Grove follows a simple principle. People who belong act like they belong. They don't hesitate, don't look around nervously, don't question their right to access. Jones understood this. He wore dark clothing that could pass for staff uniform in dim light. He carried the hollowed-out book casually, like it was a notebook or prop for the ceremony. He moved toward the gathering crowd with confidence. Once in the crowd, he was invisible. Hundreds of robed figures, all anonymous, all focused on the ceremony. He positioned himself at the edge, behind a massive redwood trunk, and filmed for 17 minutes. The footage he captured showed exactly what Grove officials had always described: a theatrical ritual performed in robes, involving a stone owl and a symbolic burning. No human sacrifice, no occult summoning, no illegal activity, just theatre. But the image was undeniably strange. Powerful men in robes, chanting in unison, watching an effigy burn while a voice boomed about destroying care and conscience. The footage went viral when Jones released it, spawning countless conspiracy theories, documentaries, YouTube videos, and the fact that it was kept so secret, despite being just theatre, made people wonder what else might be hidden. British journalist Jon Ronson also infiltrated the Grove around the same time. He was researching a book about extremists and conspiracy theorists, and he wanted to see the Grove for himself. He attended as a guest of a member, not a full infiltration, but still a rare glimpse inside. His account, published in Them, Adventures with Extremists, was more measured than Jones's. He confirmed the rituals are real, the secrecy is absolute, and the membership includes some of the most powerful people in the world. But he also noted the strange disconnect between the ceremony's dramatic presentation and the casual atmosphere afterward. Members treated it like any other theatre performance, applauding at the end, then heading back to their camps for drinks. Ronson wrote, "The cremation of care is the most bizarre piece of theatre I've ever witnessed. But what struck me wasn't the ritual itself. It was how normal the participants found it. They'd been doing this for decades. It was tradition. And tradition, no matter how strange, becomes invisible to those who practice it." What neither infiltration could reveal was the content of private conversations. What was said in the cabins? What was discussed during late-night walks through the forest? What agreements, explicit or implicit, were reached over drinks and campfires? That remains unknown, and perhaps that's the point. The Grove doesn't hide its rituals because the rituals are sinister. It hides its conversations because the conversations are powerful. The cremation of care is theatre, strange theatre, symbolic theatre, theatre that reinforces a particular worldview, but theatre nonetheless. The real secret is what happens after the ceremony ends. Part 10. The Conspiracy. Let's be clear about what Bohemian Grove is not. It is not a site of human sacrifice. No credible evidence supports this. The rituals involve effigies, not people. Claims of ritual murder based on misinterpretation, deliberate misrepresentation, or outright fabrication. It is not a centre of occult magic. The owl symbolises Minerva, Roman goddess of wisdom. The ceremony is theatrical, not supernatural. There are no spells being cast, no demons being summoned, no supernatural forces being invoked. The participants are powerful, but they're not wizards. It is not illegal. Everything that happens at the Grove, so far as we know, is protected by privacy rights and freedom of association. Wealthy people are allowed to form private clubs. They're allowed to perform strange rituals. They're allowed to network with each other. None of that violates any law. But here's what it might be: a coordination space. A place where people who control industries, governments and militaries can speak freely, without record, without oversight, and without the constraints of public accountability. Think about how policy normally works in a democracy. Proposed legislation is debated publicly, congressional hearings are held, interest groups lobby openly, the press covers developments, citizens can track how their representatives vote, can pressure them, can vote them out if they disagree with their decisions. But what happens when the people making policy, or influencing those who make policy, can meet privately to coordinate positions before any public process begins? What happens when a CEO and a senator can agree on environmental regulations before any bill is introduced, ensuring the final legislation will benefit the CEO's company? What happens when a general and a defence contractor can discuss weapon systems before any Pentagon procurement process begins, ensuring the contractor's bid will be favoured? What happens when industry executives can brief politicians on their preferred policies, provide talking points, coordinate strategies, all before any congressional debate occurs? That's not illegal. But it subverts the democratic process. It creates a shadow channel where decisions are shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. The Grove provides that channel, a bonding mechanism. Shared rituals create loyalty. When you've stood beside someone in a robe, chanting at an owl statue, you've shared something strange and intimate. That creates trust. That creates obligation. Psychological research on group bonding is clear. Shared experiences, especially unusual or emotionally significant experiences, create strong social ties. Military units use shared hardship to build cohesion. Fraternities use initiation rituals to create loyalty. Religious communities use ceremonies to reinforce belonging. The Bohemian Groves rituals serve the same function. When a CEO and a politician participate in the cremation of care together, they're not just watching theatre. They're engaging in a shared ritual that marks them as part of the same tribe. They're members of the same exclusive club. They've participated in the same strange ceremony. That creates a bond that transcends professional relationships. And bonds create obligations. If you're a senator and you need to make a decision that will affect a company, and the CEO of that company is a fellow Grove member who stood beside you at the cremation of care, that relationship affects your thinking. Not overtly, not through explicit corruption, but through the subtle influence of social connection, a pressure release valve. The cremation of care isn't just symbolic fun, it's a psychological tool. It tells participants they can temporarily shed moral weight. And if you're making decisions that affect millions of lives, that kind of psychological permission might be useful. Consider what these men do in their normal lives. CEOs make decisions that result in layoffs, that prioritise shareholders over workers, that externalise environmental costs onto communities. Politicians make decisions that send soldiers to war, that cut social programmes to reduce deficits, that protect certain industries while others struggle. Generals make decisions that result in deaths, enemy deaths, civilian deaths, sometimes the deaths of their own troops. Those decisions have moral weight. Human psychology requires us to either justify those decisions or carry guilt about them. The cremation of care offers a third option: ritualise permission to stop caring, even temporarily, even symbolically. It's not that Grove members are cartoonishly evil, cackling as they burn effigies and plot world domination. It's that they've created a space where moral consideration can be set aside, where strategic thinking can proceed without the burden of conscience, where decisions can be made purely on the basis of power and benefit. None of this is provable, but correlation is compelling. When the same people who attend Bohemian Grove later shape policy, wage wars, shift economies, and redefine global power structures, and when those decisions consistently benefit the same small circle of attendees, questions are inevitable. The conspiracy isn't that they're worshipping Satan or performing dark magic. The conspiracy is that they've created a space where power can coordinate without accountability, where relationships can be built that transcend democratic oversight, where decisions can be shaped before the public even knows there's a decision to be made. That's subtle, that's sophisticated, that's far more disturbing than any ritual. Part 11. The Present. Bohemian Grove still meets every summer, 2 weeks in July, same location, same rituals, same secrecy. The encampment now occurs in the age of social media, satellite imagery, and ubiquitous surveillance technology, yet somehow it remains largely hidden. The Grove has adapted its security to modern threats. Cell phone jammers are rumoured to be in use during sensitive gatherings. Drone detection systems protect against aerial photography. Digital surveillance of employees and members has intensified. Membership remains exclusive. Waiting lists stretch for years. Entry requires wealth, influence, or both. The initiation fee alone is tens of thousands of dollars, with annual dues to match. For most Americans, that cost is prohibitive. For the members, it's trivial. The demographics have shifted slightly over recent decades. While still overwhelmingly white and exclusively male, the Grove has admitted more tech CEOs, more international business leaders, more financiers from the globalized economy. The old guard, industrialists and politicians, share the camps with newer power brokers, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs. But the core purpose remains unchanged. Modern technology has made secrecy harder. Satellite imagery shows the layout. Anyone with Google Earth can see the camps, the stages, even the owl statue. Leaked membership lists circulate online, though the Grove denies their accuracy. Former staff occasionally break their NDAs and share fragments of stories, usually anonymously, usually with little concrete detail. But the core remains locked. No one outside the Grove knows what is said there. No one knows what deals are discussed. No one knows what coordination happens between the people who control the levers of power. In 2008, during the encampment, the financial crisis was already building. Members that summer included executives from banks that would soon fail, regulators who would be tasked with managing the collapse, politicians who would vote on bailout packages. What was discussed? What preparations were made? What understandings were reached about how the crisis would be managed? We don't know. In 2016, during the encampment, the presidential campaign was reaching its climax. Members included political operatives, major donors, media executives who would cover the race. What was discussed? What strategies were coordinated? What narratives were agreed upon? We don't know. In 2020, the encampment was cancelled due to the pandemic. For the first time in over a century, the Grove didn't meet, but in 2021 it resumed. Members included pharmaceutical executives, public health officials, politicians dealing with pandemic response. What was discussed about vaccine policy, about mandates, about the balance between public health and economic concerns? We don't know. And that's the real conspiracy. Not devil worship, not occult magic, not human sacrifice. Just power, gathering in private, away from scrutiny, talking without record. Epilogue: The Question. Here's what we know for certain. Bohemian Grove exists. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It's a registered private club with a physical address, property deeds, tax records. The world's most powerful men meet there every summer. Membership lists, partial, sometimes outdated but largely accurate, have been leaked over the years. They confirm the presence of presidents, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, generals, intelligence directors, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They perform rituals involving a stone owl and symbolic burning. Alex Jones's footage confirmed this. John Ronson's account confirmed this. Even the Grove's official materials acknowledge the cremation of care ceremony. They enforce absolute secrecy. The rules are documented. The NDAs are real. The security is professional and serious. They have done this for over a century. Bohemian Grove's annual encampments began in 1899 and have continued with only rare interruptions ever since. Major historical events, the Manhattan Project, political coups, economic shifts, wars, have followed closely after Grove gatherings, involving people who attended those gatherings. The correlations are documented in historical records, biographies, declassified documents. Here's what we don't know. what they talk about. No recordings exist, no transcripts, no leaked documents describing specific conversations. What they decide. Do explicit agreements get made? Or is it all just informal networking? We don't know. What they coordinate. Are strategies developed at the Grove later implemented in policy? Or are the connections purely social? We don't know. Whether any of it is illegal. Nothing we know about the Grove involves criminal activity. But legality and ethics aren't the same thing. Whether any of it should concern us. Is this just how power works in any society? Or is it a subversion of democratic principles? Reasonable people disagree. So the question isn't really, what happens at Bohemian Grove? The question is, why does the world's leadership need a place where no records exist? Think about that for a moment. These are people who run countries, corporations, militaries. Their decisions affect billions of people. Their policies shape economies, determine which nations prosper and which struggle, influence whether wars are fought or peace is maintained. Shouldn't those decisions be made transparently? Shouldn't the conversations that lead to those decisions be documented? Shouldn't the public have some window into how power is exercised on their behalf? The Grove's defenders argue that powerful people deserve privacy, that they need a space to speak freely without every word being analysed, that informal relationships and frank conversations are necessary for effective leadership. And there's truth in that, but there's also danger in it, because power without accountability tends toward abuse. Not always, not necessarily, but the tendency is there. Human psychology is clear on this. People in positions of power, insulated from consequences, gradually come to see their own interests and the public interest as identical. The Grove provides that insulation. It creates a space where the powerful can meet without oversight, can form relationships without transparency, can coordinate without accountability. Is it harmless networking? Is it strategic coordination? Or is it a reminder that real power operates best in the shadows, where questions can't be asked, where deals can't be documented, and where the people making decisions that shape our world never have to explain themselves? You decide, because the Grove isn't going anywhere, and neither are the secrets it keeps. Every July they gather, beneath the redwoods, around the owl, away from the world, and we're left outside watching shadows, asking questions, piecing together fragments of truth. Maybe that's exactly how they want it. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know and makes a real difference in keeping these stories coming to you. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is for you, and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It creates this amazing global community of truth seekers and curious minds. Now, let's get into tonight's investigation. There are places on Earth where the official story feels too clean, too rehearsed, like someone scrubbed the details until only the safe parts remained. Mount Shasta is one of those places. Rising over 14,000 feet above Northern California, it dominates the landscape like a frozen sentinel, beautiful and enigmatic. For over a century, stories have circulated about what lies beneath this mountain. stories of underground cities, stories of ancient civilizations, stories that get dismissed as folklore, New Age fantasy, or the rambling of imaginative hikers who spent too long in thin air. But what if the dismissal is the cover-up? What if something beneath Mount Shasta forced the United States government to seal tunnels, confiscate research, and silence witnesses for nearly 90 years? This is the story of Harold Finnerty, a man who took his secrets to the grave. This is the story of his granddaughter Lila, who refused to let those secrets stay buried. And this is the story of what they found in the mountain. Something that challenges everything we think we know about human history. March 1979. The Deathbed Note. Harold Finnerty died on a grey morning in Ashland, Oregon. Heart failure, the doctor said. Quick and relatively painless for a man in his late 70s. He had lived a quiet life after retiring from the United States Geological Survey, tending a small garden, reading military history and keeping mostly to himself. His neighbours described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who never quite seemed at ease, even in his own home. His granddaughter Lila arrived 3 days after his death to help sort through his belongings. She had always been close to Harold, closer than most grandchildren manage with their grandparents. He had encouraged her curiosity, her questions, her refusal to accept simple answers to complex problems. As a child, she had asked him why the sky was blue, and instead of giving her the standard explanation, he had taught her about wavelengths and atmospheric scattering. That was Harold. He never dumbed things down. The house smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. Leela moved through the room slowly, feeling the weight of absence in every corner. Harold's desk sat near the window, covered in papers and notebooks. She began sorting them into piles: financial documents, personal letters, old survey maps from his USGS days. It was methodical work, the kind that keeps your hands busy while your mind processes grief. Then she found the envelope. It was tucked inside a locked drawer in the bottom of his desk, beneath a false bottom she only discovered because the drawer seemed too shallow compared to the others. The envelope was thick, made of heavy paper that had yellowed with age. Across the front, in Harold's precise handwriting, were words that made her stop breathing for just a moment. Mount Shasta. Do not open classified. Lila sat back in the chair, holding the envelope up to the light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Harold had worked on dozens of geological surveys during his career. She'd seen his maps before, his field notes, his careful documentation of rock formations and water tables, but she'd never seen anything marked classified. The USGS did not deal in classified material. They mapped the Earth's surface. They studied earthquakes and volcanoes. They published their findings for other scientists to review. So why would her grandfather have a sealed envelope marked with government classification warnings? She broke the seal. Inside were 3 items. The first was a hand-drawn topographic map of Mount Shasta, rendered with the kind of precision that came from decades of professional cartography. The mountain's familiar silhouette was marked with contour lines, drainage patterns, and geological features. But there was something else. On the eastern side of the mountain, below the tree line, a location was marked with a red X and labelled in small, urgent letters, Adit 7. Closed 1934. The second item was a series of photographs, black and white, badly faded. They showed the interior of what looked like a tunnel or cave. The walls appeared smooth, too smooth for natural rock formations. In one photograph, a hand was pressed against the wall for scale. The texture looked almost metallic, reflective in the harsh light of the camera flash. The third item was a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. The mountain is hollow in the wrong places. They found something in 1934. We sealed it, but it wakes. Lila read the note 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Harold's handwriting, no question. But the words felt wrong, almost panicked. Harold had been a scientist, rational to his core. He did not write about mountains waking or hollow spaces in wrong places. He wrote about basalt layers and glacial movements and tectonic activity. She was still holding the note when she heard the vehicles pull up outside. 2 black SUVs parked in front of Harold's house. 4 men in dark suits emerged, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that suggested military or federal training. Lila watched from the window as they approached the front door. No badges visible, no agency identification. Just 4 men who knocked once firmly and then waited. She opened the door. "Miss Finnerty?" The man hissed. Front was tall, late 40s, with a face that gave away nothing. "We're here to collect materials related to your grandfather's work with the United States Geological Survey. It's standard procedure when a former employee with security clearance passes away." "Security clearance?" Lila kept her voice steady. "My grandfather was a cartographer. He mapped mountains." Nevertheless, the man's expression did not change. "We need to collect his notebooks, maps, and any documents related to his survey work. It will only take a few minutes." They were inside before she could protest. They moved through Harold's house like they had done this before, opening drawers, checking shelves, moving with practiced efficiency. They took his notebooks. They took his old survey equipment. They took boxes of papers from the garage that Lila had not even opened yet. The tall man noticed her watching. "This is routine, Miss Finnerty. Nothing to be concerned about." "Then why do you need his old maps?" "Government property. Technically, any work he did while employed by the USGS belongs to the federal government. We're just reclaiming what's ours." They were gone in less than 20 minutes. Lila stood in the now ransacked house, feeling like she had just been robbed by her own government. But they had not found the envelope. It was still in her jacket pocket, pressed against her chest like a secret heartbeat. That night she spread the map and photographs across her kitchen table and began to research. If someone wanted Harold's materials badly enough to confiscate them within days of his death, then those materials contained something worth hiding. She was going to find out what. The real history, they tell us, Mount Shasta has always been a mountain wrapped in mystery. For the indigenous Karuk, Shasta and Modoc peoples, it was a sacred place, home to the Great Spirit. White settlers arriving in the mid-1800s found themselves equally drawn to the mountain's imposing presence, and soon stories began circulating about what might lie beneath its snow-covered slopes. The Lemurian legend emerged in the late 1880s. According to the story, survivors of a lost continent called Lemuria, similar to Atlantis, had fled to Mount Shasta and established an underground city called Telos. These tall, white-robed figures would occasionally emerge to purchase supplies in nearby towns, paying with gold nuggets of unusual purity. In August of 1884, the San Francisco Chronicle published an account from a prospector named J.C. Brown, who claimed to have discovered an underground city carved into the mountain, complete with gold shields, hieroglyphs, and mummified remains of beings over 8 feet tall. The story captivated readers, though Brown mysteriously vanished before he could lead an expedition back to the site. By 1904, the legend had solidified with the publication of A Dweller on Two Planets, written by Frederick Spencer Oliver. The book described advanced beings living beneath Shasta, possessing technology far beyond human capability. It became a foundational text for the New Age movement and cemented Mount Shasta's reputation as a centre of mystical activity. But here is what the legends do not tell you. Here is the part that gets buried beneath the folklore and the New Age tourism. The United States Geological Survey began heavily mapping Mount Shasta in 1925. Teams of surveyors spent months in the field, documenting every ridge, every canyon, every geological formation. They returned in 1932 for more detailed work, and then again in 1934. Something happened during that 1934 survey. The official records are sparse, almost deliberately vague. A USGS team led by a geologist named Thomas Eldridge was conducting cave surveys on the eastern face of the mountain and they disappeared for 48 hours. When they finally emerged, their report mentioned disorientation and strange acoustics inside the cavern system. They noted that sounds echoed in ways that seemed impossible given the cave's dimensions, and they experienced unusual equipment malfunctions that they could not explain. The report was filed and then seemingly forgotten, except the surveying tunnels designated Adit 1 through Adit 9 were all quietly sealed within months. The official reason given was structural instability and risk of collapse. No further surveys were conducted in that region for over 20 years. Then there was the aerial incident of 1945. During post-war mapping missions, United States Army Air Force pilots were conducting photographic surveys of the West Coast. One pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, documented an unusual observation in his flight log. While circling the south face of Mount Shasta, he noted what appeared to be an opening in the rock face that reflected light in a metallic manner. He circled back for a second pass and took additional photographs. The photographs exist. They are part of the official military archive. But the official explanation given was ice reflection, a play of light on glacial formations. The opening Lieutenant Webb documented does not appear on any current geological survey. When Lila Finnerty began researching these incidents, she was not looking for proof of underground cities or lost civilizations. She was looking for an explanation of why her grandfather would have a sealed envelope marked classified, and why federal agents would confiscate his materials within days of his death. What she found instead was a pattern of official interest, official secrecy, and official dismissal that stretched back almost 50 years. Harold Finnerty's shadow surveys. Lila spent 3 weeks in libraries and archives, chasing down references to her grandfather's work. His official employment record with the USGS showed steady, unremarkable service from 1948 through 1976. He had worked on surveys in California, Oregon, and Washington. He had published papers on volcanic geology and tectonic mapping. Everything was normal, documented, and publicly accessible, until she found the gaps. Between 1956 and 1959, Harold's official work record showed him assigned to routine topographic surveys in the Cascade Range. But when Lila requested the specific survey reports from that period, she was told that those documents were not available for public review. When she asked why, she was informed that they had been reclassified by the Department of Defense as part of Cold War security protocols. Why would basic geological surveys be classified for national security reasons? She started searching for anything Harold might have left behind that the federal agents had missed. She checked his house again, more carefully this time, looking for hiding places she might have overlooked. She found them in the garage, tucked inside the hollow leg of an old workbench. More notebooks. These were different from his official USGS field books. The pages were water-stained, the handwriting hurried, almost frantic in places. They were dated between 1956 and 1959, the exact years of the classified surveys. Lila spread them across her table and began reading. The surveys had been ordered by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, not the USGS. Harold had been temporarily assigned to a joint military-civilian team conducting what was officially described as seismic monitoring research. The Cold War was at its height, and the government was deeply concerned about detecting Soviet nuclear tests. Seismic stations were being established throughout the western United States to create an early warning network. But Harold's notes describe something else entirely. Subterranean resonance patterns inconsistent with known cave systems, he wrote on one page. Echoes suggest regular geometric spacing beneath primary cavern. On another page, thermal void pockets at depths that should not support such temperatures, heat source unknown. And then, circled in red ink, not natural. Lila felt something shift in her understanding. Her grandfather had not been mapping the surface of Mount Shasta. He had been mapping what was beneath it, and he had found something that should not exist. She kept reading. References to Cyclopean geometry, a term usually reserved for massive ancient stonework like the walls of Mycenae or the temples of Malta, references to metallic signatures in soil samples, references to electromagnetic anomalies that interfered with surveying equipment. One entry from July 1958 was particularly striking. Descended into a DEET 7 with the team. The tunnel extends far beyond the 1934 seal. We broke through yesterday. The corridor beyond is not natural. The walls are too smooth. The angles are too precise. There is a smell like ozone and hot metal. The temperature rises as you descend. At the third junction, we found markings. Not native, not English, not any language we recognise. Lila stopped reading and sat back, her mind racing. Adit 7. The same designation marked on the map Harold had sealed in the envelope. There was more. Clipped to the back of one notebook was a photograph, black and white, badly faded. It showed 3 men standing in front of what looked like a tunnel entrance. The men wore field gear from the 1950s. Behind them, barely visible in the dim light, was a wall that looked too smooth to be natural rock. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 3 names: Harold Finnerty, James Pollock, Thomas Eldridge. Thomas Eldridge, the same name from the 1934 USGS team that disappeared for 48 hours. Lila grabbed her laptop and started searching. Thomas Eldridge had led the 1934 survey. According to newspaper archives, he had gone missing 3 months after returning from Mount Shasta. His body was never found. The official report called it a hiking accident, though no evidence of such an accident was ever documented. All of his maps and field notes had been seized by the Department of the Interior in October 1934. 24 years later, Harold Finnerty was working with a team that included Thomas Eldridge's name on the back of a photograph. Either the man had not died in 1934, or Harold had been studying Eldridge's original work. There was one more item in the notebooks that made Lila's hands tremble as she held it. A letter Harold had written, but apparently never sent, dated June 1952. The tunnels extend far beneath the volcanic shelf. Eldridge was right. The structure is artificial. The metal is older than the strata. I do not know what we have found, but I know it should not be here. I know that every instinct in me says we should seal this and walk away. But they will not stop. They need to know what it is, and I fear what will happen when they find out. Project Chasse-2, the Cold War connection. It took Lila another month to find the binder. She discovered it in a storage unit Harold had rented under a false name, a detail she only uncovered because he had kept the key taped under the drawer of an old filing cabinet. The storage unit was in Reading, nearly 2 hours south of where Harold had lived. Inside were boxes of materials that the federal agents had missed, things Harold had clearly hidden away deliberately. The binder was labelled Chasse-2, Cold War Seismic Anomaly Study, 1957. This was not folklore. This was not conspiracy theory. This was a real government document stamped with Department of Defense insignia, complete with project codes and authorization signatures. During the 1950s, the United States government genuinely did conduct extensive seismic and geological studies on West Coast volcanoes. The official purpose was monitoring for nuclear tests, creating a network of sensors that could detect underground explosions anywhere on the planet. Mount Shasta, as one of the tallest and most geologically active peaks in the Cascades, was a natural choice for such monitoring. But the Chasse-2 binder contained information that went far beyond seismic monitoring. The first section documented equipment malfunctions in the Shasta region. Magnetometers going haywire, seismographs recording vibrations that did not match any known geological activity, radio interference so severe that teams had to communicate using written notes because their walkie-talkies produced only static. The second section was titled Structural Analysis. Here, the language became more technical and more disturbing. Engineers described finding echo patterns that suggested large hollow spaces deep beneath the mountain, spaces that did not match known cave systems. The geometry was wrong. Natural caves form along fracture lines and water channels, creating irregular organic patterns. The spaces beneath Shasta formed regular geometric shapes. One page was marked with a red stamp, structural echoes unlike caves. Another page, metallic signature below basalt layers, and then, circled in black ink, do not breach. Layer 5, Layer 5. Lila flipped through the binder, looking for any reference to what Layer 5 might be. She found it near the back, in a section marked Recommendations. The language was bureaucratic, carefully neutral, but the message was clear. Further excavation beyond Layer 4 is not recommended. Preliminary analysis suggests that Layer 5 contains the primary anomaly source. Equipment failures increase significantly at depths below 1200 meters. Structural integrity of surrounding rock questionable. Team safety cannot be guaranteed. Translation. They found something deep in the mountain, and they were afraid to dig any deeper. The final item in the binder made Lila question everything she thought she understood about her government's relationship with the truth. It was a transcript, dated March 1971. The header read, Remote Viewing Session, Subject, Anomalous Geological Formation. Location, Northern California. Remote viewing. The CIA program that trained psychics to spy on Soviet installations by projecting their consciousness across space. Lila knew about Project Stargate. It had been declassified in the mid-1990s, revealed to the public as one of the strange artifacts of Cold War paranoia. The program officially began in 1972, but this transcript was dated 1971, a year before Stargate supposedly started. The transcript was formatted like an interview. Handler. Please describe what you perceive at the target location. Viewer. 12. I see stone. No, not stone. Metal. It looks like metal but old. Very old. Covered in stone. Handler. Can you describe the shape? Viewer. 12. A chamber. Big. The walls curve up like a dome. There are patterns on the metal. Symbols, maybe. I cannot read them. Handler. Where is this chamber located? Viewer. 12. Under snow. A tall mountain. North of Reading. Very deep. It is cold there, but the chamber is warm. There is something in the centre. It glows faintly. Handler. What is in the centre? Viewer. 12. I do not want to look at it. It feels wrong, like it is watching me even though I am not really there. Handler. Please continue. Viewer. 12. A sphere. Silver or grey. It sits on a pedestal. The pedestal is not human. The proportions are wrong. Everything about this place feels wrong. Whoever built this was not human. Handler. You're safe. The target cannot harm you. Continue. Viewer. 12. There are handprints on the wall near the entrance, pressed into the metal when it was soft. 5 fingers on the left hand, 6 fingers on the right. They are not human hands. The transcript ended there, stamped with a code. Session terminated. Viewer distress. Lila sat in the storage unit for a long time, holding the transcript in her hands. This was not legend. This was not folklore passed down through generations of New Age believers. This was a classified government document describing something beneath Mount Shasta that should not exist. Her grandfather had been part of the team that found it, and now she needed to find it herself. Finding Adit 7. Lila spent 2 months preparing. She was not a mountaineer, not a splunker, not trained for underground exploration. But she was Harold Finnerty's granddaughter, and she inherited his stubbornness along with his curiosity. She bought equipment. She studied maps. She read everything she could find about the eastern face of Mount Shasta, the McCloud region, the Mud Creek drainage area, and Dilla Canyon. Adit 7 had been sealed in 1934. According to mining records, it was one of 9 exploratory tunnels dug during a brief period when prospectors believed there might be valuable mineral deposits in the volcanic rock. The tunnels had been abandoned when no significant ore was found, and most had collapsed or been deliberately sealed due to safety concerns. But Harold's map showed that Adit 7 went deeper than the official records indicated. Much deeper. Lila drove to Mount Shasta in late October, when the tourist season had ended and the backcountry roads were mostly empty. She parked her truck near the old McLeod logging road and hiked in, carrying 60 pounds of gear on her back. The entrance to Adit 7 was supposed to be at roughly 8,000 feet elevation, hidden in a fold of rock near the tree line. It took her 3 days of searching to find it. The entrance had been buried under a rock slide, probably deliberately. Someone had piled stones across the opening and planted brush to hide it from casual hikers, but erosion had created a small gap at the top, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were determined enough. Lila was determined enough. She wriggled through the gap, her headlamp cutting a narrow beam into the darkness beyond. The air inside was cold and dry, smelling of dust and stone. The tunnel stretched ahead, carved through volcanic rock, the walls rough and irregular. This was consistent with the mining tunnels from the 1930s, hand-drilled and blasted by men looking for gold or silver. She followed the tunnel down, descending into the mountain. After 50 yards, the character of the tunnel changed. The walls became smoother, the angles more precise. The temperature rose slightly, enough to notice. After 100 yards, she found the seal. It was a concrete wall, thick and professionally installed, completely blocking the tunnel. Stamped into the concrete was a date, November 1934. This was the official seal, the one placed after Thomas Eldridge's team reported their disorientation and strange experiences. But Harold's notes had said they broke through the seal in 1958. She examined the concrete wall carefully, running her hands over the surface, and then she found it. A crack, barely visible, running from floor to ceiling along the left side. Someone had cut through the concrete and then carefully sealed it again. The newer concrete was slightly different in colour, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Lila pulled out her tools and began chipping away at the newer section. The concrete was old enough to crumble easily under the impact of a hammer and chisel. It took her 2 hours, but she finally broke through. The tunnel beyond was different. The walls were smooth, almost polished. The rock looked melted rather than carved, like something impossibly hot had bored through the volcanic stone. The floor sloped downward at a steady angle, descending deeper into the mountain. Her headlamp beam reflected strangely off the walls, creating odd patterns of light and shadow. She walked for what felt like an hour, though her watch said only 20 minutes had passed. Time felt wrong down here. Sounds felt wrong too. Her footsteps echoed in ways that made no sense, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible, as if the tunnel itself was changing its acoustic properties. The temperature continued to rise. By the time she reached the junction, it was uncomfortably warm, like being in a greenhouse on a summer day. She checked her thermometer. 85 degrees. That made no sense. She was deep inside a mountain that had snow on its peaks. It should be near freezing, not warm enough to make her sweat. The junction split into 3 passages. The centre passage was marked with a cairn of stones deliberately placed. Someone before her had marked the way. Harold? Thomas Eldridge? She did not know. She followed the centre passage. The walls here were not stone. They were metal. Smooth grey metal that looked old beyond measure, tarnished but not rusted. She reached out to touch it, and the surface was warm, almost body temperature. Patterns were etched into the metal, repeating geometric designs that looked almost like writing but followed no linguistic structure she recognised. This was what Harold had meant. This was what should not be here. Metal walls inside a volcanic mountain, warm to the touch, covered in symbols that predated any known language. She kept walking, and the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The chamber beneath the mountain. The chamber was enormous. Lila's headlamp beam could not reach the far wall. The ceiling curved upward into a dome, just like Viewer 12 had described in the remote viewing transcript. The floor was made of the same grey metal, smooth and slightly warm beneath her boots. She pulled out a flashlight, a heavy-duty spotlight she had bought specifically for this expedition, and switched it on. The beam swept across the chamber, revealing its true size. It was easily 200 feet across, maybe more. The metal floor was inscribed with concentric circles, radiating outward from a central pedestal. Lila walked toward the centre, her footsteps echoing strangely in the vast space. The acoustics were wrong, just like the USGS report from 1934 had noted. Some sounds echoed loudly, bouncing off the curved walls. Other sounds were absorbed, deadened, as if the chamber itself was selectively filtering noise. Near the wall she found what the remote viewer had described. Handprints pressed into the metal, fossilized in whatever substance had been soft enough to take an impression before it hardened. The left hand had 5 fingers, the right hand had 6. The proportions were close to human, but not quite right. The fingers were longer, the palm narrower. Whoever had built this place was not human. Or if they were human in a way that predated everything anthropologists thought they knew about human evolution. The pedestal in the centre of the chamber rose about 4 feet from the floor. It was made of the same metal as everything else, but the surface was covered in more intricate patterns, symbols layered upon symbols in a way that suggested deep meaning if only you could read the language. On top of the pedestal sat a sphere. It was roughly the size of a basketball, perfectly smooth, made of metal that looked silver in her flashlight beam. The surface was covered in tiny inscriptions, spiralling around the sphere in lines so fine they were almost invisible. As Lila approached, she felt something shift in the air around her. A vibration, barely perceptible, like standing next to high-voltage power lines. This was the artifact Harold had sketched in his notebooks. This was what the government had sealed behind concrete and bureaucratic silence for nearly 50 years. Near the base of the pedestal, someone had left a metal plaque. The plaque was newer than the chamber, maybe from the 1950s based on the style of the lettering. It read, "Eldridge found the heart. We were never meant to open it." Lila stood there for a long time staring at the sphere. Every instinct told her not to touch it. The warnings in Harold's notes, the government's desperate attempts to seal this place, the plaque left by someone who clearly feared what they had discovered, all of it screamed danger. But she had come this far. She had broken through the seals. She had descended into the mountain. She needed to understand what this thing was. She reached out and touched the sphere. For a moment nothing happened. The metal was warm, warmer than the air around it, and the surface felt slightly rough, like fine sandpaper. Then the inscriptions began to glow. Faint blue light traced the spiral patterns, spreading from where her hand made contact outward, across the entire surface of the sphere. The vibration in the air intensified. Lila pulled her hand back, but the glow continued, growing brighter. The chamber itself seemed to respond, the walls humming with a low frequency that she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears. She checked her thermal reader. The temperature had spiked. The sphere was now registering at over 200 degrees, though it had not felt that hot when she touched it. The floor beneath the pedestal was glowing faintly, lines of light spreading outward along the concentric circles. Something beneath the chamber was waking up. Lila backed away from the pedestal, her heart hammering. This was not an artifact. This was not a relic of a dead civilization. This was a machine, still functional, still powered by something that had survived for thousands of years or longer. She needed to leave. Now. She ran back toward the tunnel entrance, the chamber's glow brightening behind her. The hum became a rhythmic pulse, mechanical and deliberate. Whatever she had activated was not shutting down. If anything, it was building towards something, a cycle that had been interrupted decades ago and was now resuming. Harold's final message. Lila made it back to her truck just as the sun was setting. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She drove back to town, checked into a motel, and collapsed on the bed, exhausted and terrified. That night she could not sleep. She kept hearing the hum from the chamber, that mechanical pulse that felt older than humanity itself. She kept seeing the glow spreading across the sphere, the light tracing patterns that might have been writing, or might have been something else entirely, some form of communication that humans were never meant to understand. She needed to know what Harold had thought about all this. She needed to hear his voice, his reasoning, his conclusions. She went back to the boxes of materials she'd taken from his storage unit and searched through everything one more time. She found the tape recorder buried at the bottom of a box of old survey equipment. It was an old reel-to-reel model from the 1970s, the kind Harold would have used for field notes. A single tape was still loaded on the reels. She pressed play. Harold's voice filled the room, older than she remembered, tired but clear. This is Harold Finnerty, recording on March 8th, 1979. If you are listening to this, it means I am dead, and it means you found what I have hidden. Good. Someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand what we found beneath Mount Shasta. In 1958, our team broke through the seal that Eldridge's team had placed in 1934. We descended into the mountain, following tunnels that should not exist, tunnels that were not created by natural geological processes or by human mining equipment. The tunnels led us to a chamber. Inside that chamber we found evidence of a civilization that predates anything in the archaeological record. The metal is older than the rock surrounding it. Carbon dating puts the surrounding basalt at roughly 300,000 years old. The metal cannot be dated using conventional methods, but analysis of the oxidation pattern suggests it is far, far older. Millions of years, perhaps. We found a machine. Not ruins, not artifacts. An active, functional machine built by intelligences we cannot comprehend. When we activated it, we triggered something. Seismographs across Northern California recorded vibrations that did not match any known seismic activity. The vibrations came from beneath Mount Shasta, rhythmic and mechanical, like something vast was coming back to life after sleeping for eons. We sealed it again. We had to. The government ordered us to bury everything we found, to seal the chamber, and never speak of it. They were afraid, not of what the public would think, but of what the machine might do if we continued to interfere with it. But here is what they did not understand. Here is what I did not understand until years later. The machine does not need us to activate it. It wakes on its own. Every few decades, seismographs pick up those same vibrations. They are always attributed to minor earthquakes, tectonic adjustments, volcanic activity. But I know better. The machine beneath Mount Shasta is not from a lost human civilization. It is older, it is alien, and it is waiting. I do not know what it is waiting for. I do not know what it will do when it fully awakens. I only know that we were never meant to find it, and we were certainly never meant to activate it. If you have listened to this tape, if you have found my notes and my maps, please understand the weight of what I am telling you. The truth is not what you think. The mountain is not what you think. And we are not alone in our history. The tape ended with a click, and the room fell silent. Lila sat there for a long time, processing what she had heard. Harold had known. He had known for over 20 years that something was beneath the mountain, something that challenged everything humanity believed about its place in the universe and its timeline on Earth. And now she had activated it again. The cover-up arrives. Lila checked out of the motel the next morning and started driving south. She planned to go to Sacramento, maybe find a journalist or a researcher who would take her evidence seriously. She had photographs. She had Harold's notes. She had the tape recording. Someone needed to know what was beneath Mount Shasta. She made it 20 miles before she noticed the black SUVs. There were 3 of them, travelling in formation, keeping a steady distance behind her. When she sped up, they sped up. When she slowed down, they matched her pace. They were not even trying to hide their presence. Lila pulled off the highway at a rest stop. The SUVs pulled in behind her. 6 men emerged, wearing the same dark suits and expressionless faces she'd seen at Harold's house. The man in front was tall, late 40s, with cold eyes that suggested he had done this many times before. He walked up to her truck window. "Miss Finnerty, we need you to come with us." "Who are you?" "That is not relevant. What is relevant is that you entered a restricted area yesterday. You accessed classified materials. You activated equipment that poses a significant security risk." "I do not know what you're talking about." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You saw the interior. That means you know too much. We can do this easily, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Lila looked at the 6 men surrounding her truck. She looked at the empty rest stop, no other vehicles in sight. She looked at the man's cold eyes and understood that she was not going to talk her way out of this. She needed to run. She started the truck, gunned the engine, and drove straight at the man in front of her. He dove aside and she swerved around the SUVs, accelerating back onto the highway. Behind her, the SUVs scrambled to follow. She drove fast, faster than she'd ever driven, weaving through traffic, taking exits at random, trying to lose them in the maze of back roads. But they stayed with her, coordinated and relentless. These were professionals. They had resources she could not match. She remembered the side tunnels. When she had explored Adit 7, she had seen other passages branching off from the main corridor. Some led deeper into the mountain. Some led back toward the surface. If she could get back to the mountain, she could lose them in the tunnels. She turned north, heading back toward Mount Shasta. The SUVs followed. She drove up the old logging road, her truck bouncing over ruts and rocks, pushing the vehicle far beyond what it was designed for. She reached the area near Adit 7 just as the sun was setting. She abandoned the truck and ran into the forest, carrying only a small backpack, with her flashlight and Harold's most important notes. Behind her she heard doors slamming, men shouting, engines revving. They were coming. She made it to the rock slide covering Adit 7 and squeezed through the gap. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she ran down the tunnel, descending into the mountain. She heard voices behind her, echoing strangely in the confined space. She ran past the broken seal, past the junction, into the smooth metal corridors that should not exist. The men were still following, but they were slowing down, cautious now. They knew what was down here. They knew it was dangerous. Lila found one of the side passages and ducked into it, switching off her flashlight. She crouched in the darkness, listening. Footsteps echoed past her hiding spot, moving toward the central chamber. Radio static crackled, voices speaking in clipped military jargon. She waited in the darkness for what felt like hours. Eventually the footsteps retreated. The voices faded. She was alone again, deep inside Mount Shasta, surrounded by metal walls that hummed with ancient power. She found another passage that led upward, following the natural slope of the mountain. It took her 3 hours of climbing through narrow tunnels, but eventually she emerged on the northern face of the mountain, miles from where she'd entered. Behind her she heard helicopters. She looked back and saw lights converging on the Adit 7 region. Heavy machinery was being brought in. They were sealing it again, just like they had in 1934 and again in 1958. But this time they were not taking any chances. She heard explosions echoing across the mountain. They were collapsing the tunnels completely. The final revelation. 3 months later, Layla received a small package at a post office box she had rented under a false name. There was no return address. Inside was a fragment of metal, grey and smooth, warm to the touch even though it had been sitting in a cold mail facility. The metal was identical to the walls of the chamber beneath Mount Shasta. Wrapped around the metal was a note written in Harold's handwriting. The machine inside Shasta is not from a lost human civilization. It is older. It is waiting. Do not let them bury the truth again. But this made no sense. Harold had died before Lila ever entered the mountain. He could not have sent this package, unless he had prepared it years ago, setting up some kind of delayed delivery system, unless he had known she would go looking for answers, or unless the note was not from Harold at all. Lila spread out all her remaining evidence on her apartment floor. The photographs, the notes, the tape recording, Harold's maps, the metal fragment. She had spent 3 months in hiding, moving from town to town, afraid that the men in black SUVs would find her again. But they had not come. Maybe they thought the evidence had been destroyed. Maybe they thought she would stay silent out of fear. They were wrong. That night, the mountain rumbled. Local seismographs picked up vibrations centered directly beneath Mount Shasta. The frequency was low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. Geologists attributed it to minor tectonic adjustments. Volcanic activity settling after decades of dormancy. Nothing to be concerned about. But Lila knew better. She had heard that rhythm before, deep in the chamber, when she had touched the sphere and felt something vast wake beneath her feet. The machine was still active. The seals had not stopped it. The explosives had not buried it deeply enough. Whatever was beneath Mount Shasta, whatever Harold and Thomas Eldridge and countless others had found over the decades, it was older than human civilization. It was patient, and it was waking. No earthquake was officially reported that night, even though thousands of people across Northern California felt the tremor. The United States Geological Survey issued no statements. No warnings were given. The incident was not recorded in any official database. But Lila had felt it. She had felt the pulse of something ancient stirring beneath the mountain, counting down to a moment when it would fully awaken. And when that moment came, the government's carefully maintained silence would no longer matter. The truth beneath Mount Shasta would reveal itself, whether humanity was ready for it or not. Some mountains hold secrets in their stone. Some mountains hold mysteries in their caves. But Mount Shasta holds something else entirely. It holds evidence of intelligences that walked this earth long before we did, and it holds machines that still function after millions of years of silence. Harold Finnerty died trying to warn us. Thomas Eldridge vanished trying to understand it. Lila Finnerty risked everything to uncover it. The question is not whether the truth will come out. The question is what will happen when it does. The mountain remembers. The machine remembers. And deep beneath the snow and stone and ancient metal, something is waking. Something is waiting. Something is counting down the years until it emerges from the darkness and shows humanity just how small and young we really are in the vast timeline of this planet. Mount Shasta stands silent against the sky, beautiful and enigmatic. But if you listen carefully, if you place your hand against the stone and feel for vibrations that should not be there, you might just sense it. The rhythm, the pulse, the heartbeat of something older than human memory. And you might realize, as Harold did, as Lila did, that we were never alone on this earth. We just forgot to look beneath